Okay, we're up at 41 people now. I should say that I know many of you are not so savvy with Teams, but if you look in the top right hand corner, there is a chat function. And in the chat, I have provided 2 links. The first link is just a rough agenda for today. And today really is mostly discussion. We've got about 30 minutes of presentation just to give a bit of background to what we want to do. And then there is a second link to a Google spreadsheet. So for anyone who is interested in being part of iBand, can they click on that? It's like an Excel document, and then just put your name, email address, and then your interest of blue in whatever field, whether that be climatology, ecology, historical dating. Because the future of the interaction in iBand, or at least my aspiration, is it will all be done through MS Teams, because MS Teams allows you to archive files, have chats, discussions, and also do seminar series all in one go. It's much more versatile than Zoom in that regard. If that doesn't work, then we can rejig things. But I use MS Teams all the time for projects now. So I think that would be the so while people
for me it seems that the chat doesn't work. It says it's only for members of Teams. Is it?
Does anyone else have that
login problem maybe? Or?
Yes, I also have it.
Same here.
So you all have the same problem. So okay, so
yeah.
So can you see the chat?
No, there is nothing. And I mean, I'm familiar with Teams, so there is no chat that I can find in the usual place.
It is for this reason why I need everyone's emails, so I can invite people from external to the organization within a team. That's why I did this as an open link. Okay, then you're just going to have to all email me. So, and then I'm just going to have to do it manually.
So hopefully we'll be just a couple of people.
Is the chat that important?
No, but the information I need from you is important.
Why don't you send around the Google file that everybody can download it or access it and then enter the data?
Unfortunately, to do that, I need your email addresses, and that's the problem. I don't want to do the Google file open, because then any Tom, Dick, and Harry, I actually want it to. So I think it's just even if everyone emails me, and my email address is rjsw@st-andrews.co.uk. Google me, St Andrews Rob Wilson. You'll find my email address, and then I will add you on, and I can add you for the future to the thing. So I knew that would be a complication. I'll just let me just check to see if there's anything in the setup to allow people to have some sort of access. That's slightly annoying. Meeting options. No, I don't think it's gonna. So my email box is filling up already. So, right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly screen share. I'm going to have to switch my email off actually, because it's going to get annoying. So I'll just briefly talk through the structure of this afternoon. Can everyone see that Word document?
Yep.
Yeah. So basically, I'm just going to very brief introduction about Blue Intensity and what we hope with the iBind initiative that the ATR kind of invited me and Richard to put together a couple of years ago now. So I'm just going to very brief introduction to the whole concept, and then me, Richard, and Milos are going to give 3 very brief, slimmed down talks, which basically, if those of you who were in the workshops last weekend have probably seen some of the material, but again, we just wanted to bring you up to where we are at with the use of blue in dendrochronology. What are the challenges of using blue with regards to where we move, and then potential innovations that Milos will quickly move on with regards to the future. And then the bulk of this, unfortunately, none of you can see is really we want to sort of come up with a vision. We have our own personal vision, but we want this to be a sort of group community initiative. Anyone interested in being part of the coordination team, which is ideally people who are already quite using Blue Intensity quite a lot in their work, we're interested in. I'm going to create an MS Teams group, and then the discussions is about actually how we want to move on this initiative in the coming weeks and months. So that could be a seminar series that we're very keen to have. Future meetings, should we have annual meetings or more frequent? Should they be thematic? You know, whether it's climatology versus historical dating. Richard and I, and also with Ignacio Mundo, we've done some Blue Intensity workshops over the last few years. These presumably will continue, but it'd be nice if we can expand the teaching team. And Mary Dendro is the next big Trace would be the next conference next year, followed by a Mary Dendro in the US. And then we'll finish off with some discussion points about challenges in blue intensity and the use of blue intensity, how we could overcome. That's my doorbell.
More guests for iBind.
Amazon again. In person.
And then we want to talk about collaboration opportunities and how we actually as a community get together depending on what our foci are and what our aims are. So that'll be very different for climatologists, very different for archaeologists and so forth. And then we're very open for ideas. So we want this to be quite, this is a sort of grassroots. It's not for us just because we've spent, I've spent 13 years plus now working with Blue Intensity and have a lot of papers, but my way is not the only way, right? And I think we all as a community need to be fully aware that there are many ways of measuring blue to utilize it, and there are many issues, and we want to basically overcome this. Okay, so that's the basic aim for today. I'm now going to start up my brief talk. He says hopefully brief. I'll try not to rabble on. I assume everyone has access to the hands up aspects of using Teams. So if you have a question, put your hand up. Richard or Milos, keep an eye on chat, or no, they haven't got chat. Keep an eye on the hands up thing, and then just shout. I don't mind if people want to jump in, but the talks should be brief, right? And I'm speaking to me, and I'm speaking to Milos, and I'm speaking to Richard. So let's keep this. I want today to be more discussion about what people are wanting, what training people might want, or how we do it, give advice and so forth. Okay, so let's just share my screen again. Can you see all that? Oh, no, you're not going to be able to see. That's the wrong screen. Let's try that one. There you go. Okay, there's my email address for those. So please email me. And I will add you and basically populate. So what I've done is I've created a group within MS Teams, and then we can utilize MS Teams for archiving of files like papers. So all the papers I think that we've got so far are there. But there is a chat option that can be used at any time, depending if you have Teams running, of course, all the time. It's no different than WhatsApp or Messenger, but within the group. And then we can also use MS Teams for giving presentations. Okay. Welcome, everyone. my advice, if could everyone switch off their microphones at least? There's a couple of crisp packets or whatever I can hear in the background, but bar that, you can keep your videos open. I think it's working fairly well. Okay, so a bit of context here is, at least from my point of view, I actually can't remember. Richard might be able to chip in here. I can't remember if we approached ATR or ATR approached us, but I do know that a couple of years ago I was working with Kathy Groves trying to date some undated buildings in England, which clearly were represented by a variety of conifer species. And although we had some success on those buildings that we knew were Scandinavian, because everything works in Scandinavia, we did struggle with some of the other buildings because basically we were working with other conifer species that probably, maybe, could be North American, but because we don't have any North American reference chronologies, we could never validate that as a hypothesis. And so, you know, the concept of what is now iBind came actually more from my frustrations with provenancing historical material rather than the climatological work that I normally do. Okay, so and certainly the ATR were very keen on putting these kind of these collaborative networks together. So there's QNet as well, and you know, it is our hope in a way that QNet and iBind certainly overlap with regards to the type of wood properties we're all measuring. So you know, we must not think of these as entirely separate initiatives, and then we'll see how they both evolve over time. It kind of scared me at the meeting when they said there was like 130, 140 members of QNet. I'm hoping the blue community will be a bit smaller. Okay, I just want to give a brief history, but I'm not quite sure, for those who have not been at the workshops, just to give you an idea where blue came from and so forth. And the focus isn't just on climatology, it's just in dendrochronology as a whole. And I think with regards to the terminology of blue intensity or blue reflectance, we really have to go back to the early 2000s with Danny McCarroll and the Swansea group. And they came out with this initial paper, blue reflectance provides a surrogate for lake wood density. And it wasn't long after this that I was involved with a large EU project with Danny and other members of the Swansea group. And I will admit that in 2005, when I saw their initial results, I could not believe how good the results were from using a basic scanner. You know, hand on heart, you know, I was just like, oh, well, that can't be, right? I had been working with density data for years. But that led me later on to try and experiment. And clearly there is, you know, a lot of information in these type of data, right? So this preliminary work from Danny McCarroll et al. Was then expanded through Rochelle Campbell, now Rochelle Graham's PhD in the Millennium Project. And she developed a couple of papers exploring the signal in blue intensity on Scots pine from Scandinavian sites. And then she was, through her work and her interactions with the Wind Dendro group, Regents, they implemented blue reflectance within Wind Dendro at that time. Now, what was surprising is, in many regards, despite a couple of long blue intensity chronologies were developed for Dachstein in Austria and then up in the Kola Peninsula up in Scandinavia, no published reconstructions using, no single reconstruction using just blue was published until at least 2014. So despite all the very positive results, there was a very slow take up of the method in the early days. And in many respects, from my point of view, it was my collaboration with Lars, I call him Lars, but Lars Larsen, who hi Lars, I probably could dig out the email. It was sort of a very tentative email back in, I think, in late 2007 about the concept of blue. And Lars very kindly replied very quickly and says, yes, this is something along the lines as this is probably possible, but who's going to pay for it? Fair enough. And then I think within about 2 weeks, he sent me a very early beta version of what we now implement in Q-Recorder with the blue intensity channel and color collectors. And actually, whilst tweaking over the years, it worked from day one, and it was quite amazing. So it was very exciting around 2008 when I realized that we were onto something that could work. But it was actually through Milosz's PhD, and then Jesper Borklund, his PhD, kind of at the same time. I think Jesper was introduced to blue at the 2009 Finland conference when I was leading one of the Field Week groups, and then Jesper then embraced blue via Windendro at the same time from that period. So there was a whole ream of papers in 2014 from Milos, from Jesper. We did at the Melbourne World Dendro, we did a session. There was a session on methods, but it was kind of dominated by the blue papers at the time. So it was kind of an exciting period of look at this method. There's a lot of potential here. So blue intensity, of how I use blue intensity, is I think of the measurement as the late wood. Okay, we're interested in the cell wall thickness. So if we have thick cell walls, we have high density values. We have darker wood essentially, so we have low reflectance. And if you're looking at the early wood, we have large cells with large lumens, therefore lots of space, low density, and then higher reflectance, brighter values. Okay, and that's my simple concept of how I personally approach blue intensity, at least with the traditional approach to it. It is very appealing. We simply measure scanners. We scan images of polished conifer samples using a standard scanner. The higher the resolution, the better, but there is definitely an upper threshold with regards to what our DPI is. But compared to densitometry, and certainly compared to quantitative wood analysis, it's very quick and basically much cheaper than standard densitometric methods. There are several packages now that you can measure blue intensity: LignaVision, Windendro, even ImageJ. But many groups are using QRecorder because it's it's a relatively cheap piece of software, and there's quite a bit of good support there. One could argue, and then we'll come on to this, about challenges, and potentially one of the avenues that IBAN should focus on is that there really is no standard protocol between different labs using different softwares or even the same software. And what does that mean? What are the implications when we're trying to share data? But that's for later discussion. So has blue intensity come of age?
Excuse me, Rob, can I ask a question about that last slide?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt and sorry for the newbie question, but why blue in particular? Thanks.
Oh, okay, that's a good question. I think Richard's going to talk about that, but I will basically, in Danny McCarroll's original paper, 2002, their hypothesis at the time is that the blue intensity parameter was measuring essentially lignin content in the wood, which was predominantly part of the late wood, and that lignin and cellulose and hemicellulose would absorb more blue light than green and red if you were looking at the simple RGB spectrum. And so if you were measuring the amount of reflectance, so how dark it was essentially, or the amount of the light was absorbed in the blue part of the spectrum, then that's why blue was chosen. Now, Richard's going to challenge that in his the little talk after this, because actually, arguably, they're probably red, blue, green are all doing similar things. And that is one area that could possibly be explored further, right? QRecorder can certainly measure red intensity, green intensity, blue intensity, and gray intensity, as can the other software packages. So blue is where it started and blue is where it's remained, but whether blue is the parameter that we continue with, that's again one of the methodological issues that people can continue exploring. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. And having a lignin lignin concentration or content recorder could also be really useful too.
Oh, so I think let's leave this for the discussion, because I'm sure Jesper's here and Jesper's probably bouncing on his seat because he does not think it's lignin content. So this is one of the areas up for debate. So we'll come back to this in the discussion. Is that okay?
Sure, thanks.
I think I touch on that as well in the talk later.
Perfect.
So we'll have time to discuss.
Yeah, good. Okay, so since Danny's paper in 2002, there's I think Richard and I, we're as part of the ATR and this initiative, we were invited by ATR to write a short sort of review type paper for Dendrochronologia. This is just literally came out in press this week. I don't know if that's by design or was just good timing. But there are about 59 papers now that have been published that have utilized blue intensity in some capacity, which is, not bad for a new method. It is what it is. It's being measured on multiple conifer species. And you can see by this map here that there's several locations around mainly the Northern Hemisphere, focused mainly on Europe and certainly on Scandinavia. But there's a lot of new work in North America, a little bit of work in Australasia area. And South America is an unpublished black hole at the moment, but there actually is quite a lot of blue data there as well. So blue data does work at least with Araucaria and Fitzroy. But maybe now, and this is why I personally am interested with the concept of the I-band initiative, is now maybe this is time to take stock where we can get a community together to start thinking about certain aspects of blue intensity. Okay, so firstly, is there a clear understanding of the blue intensity methodology across the dendrosciences? And what I mean by that is that there are aspects of the methodology that might be confusing with regards to whether it's blue intensity or blue reflectance, and whether you inverse the data or you don't inverse the data. And as a reviewer, I have reviewed papers where clearly the authors have utilized the data in a way that I think is non-optimal. I think that's my polite way of saying this. So, this is partly a way of communicating the methodology and best practice. Are current methods that we all utilize good enough? I mean, certainly what we do in St. Andrews is basically what we developed back in 2012 to 2014 into 2015 period. So we haven't moved our own methodology on. Can we do better? How comparable are the data from different labs? This is kind of crucial with standards, and Richard will talk about that in his talk. Is it possible to come up with some standard protocols so all of these data are homogeneous with regards to, if we sent the same samples around a bunch of labs, can we then bring the data together, or are there slight differences in the data and we might have to do some manipulation before we lump them together? Jesper Borklund's paper in 2019 on the density comparison and the blue comparison aspects really touched on some really interesting aspects on that issue. What areas of the methodology can be improved, right? Are we as far as we can go with standard scanner technology? And is it good enough, right? That goes back to the second point. I'm very intrigued to move forward if we possibly can. Now, when it comes to precision, we will never be able to compete with densitometry or quantitative wood analysis. But I would then counter argue, but likewise, for the amount of data that we can produce in such a short time, then we have a distinct advantage over these other parameters because we can generate so much. And as long as we as a community are aware of the limitations, then we can take those limitations into account and still utilize the data, whether that be for dating of buildings or even for climatology. Okay. And I'm very much a believer that, well, I like blue because it's cheap, right? And any methodological improvement and advancement must not then diminish the utilization of this parameter, this methodology. I mean, if blue became as expensive as densitometry, then just buy a densitometer, right? There's no point. So we need to find the sweet spot of improving the methodology, but trying at the same time not making it too expensive. So currently, blue is a method for the masses. Almost any lab can buy a relatively cheap scanner. The QRecorder software is extremely, it's a brilliant piece of software and is extremely cheap. But can that remain so if we want to really keep the robustness of the methodology as we move forward? So this is the concept, at least in what Richard and we've discussed. Through I-Bind, we want to promote the methods of blue generation, both to tree ring laboratories around the world. We want to help with methodological teaching and learning. We want to encourage labs to embrace the method and ensure a common best practice. We definitely want to encourage further development. There are going to be many, many groups now. You can see it all the time in every conference. Many groups working with the blue methodology. Some might be working with standard scanners. Some might be working with high resolution electronic microscopes and so forth. And I think through workshops and through these kind of collaborative initiatives, we can really learn from each other. We also, and this is where I talked about at the beginning, I want to encourage collaboration for the creation of regional networks, whether it be across Europe, South or North America, Asia, Australasia, and so forth. This is not just for climatological studies, but will be important for ecological studies. You know, if you need to understand the density of the wood, if you want to come up with biomass estimates, for example. And then, of course, there's the whole aspect of historical dating and provenancing. Okay, and I am fully aware, if you're a commercial lab, data exchange is a very difficult issue here, but provenancing can only work if different labs from different countries work together. So, you know, that's so I've talked about dendroprovenancing, and then further, and then Milos will talk about this. Through this initiative, hopefully we can test innovative and novel initiatives, whether that be applying blue to broadleaf species, deciduous tree species, high resolution blue methods, or just further exploration of other new species as well. I've spent a lot of time the last few years basically experimenting blue on every conifer species I could possibly find and people like to work with, and most of the time there is very useful information coming out of these species. So there is a lot out there still to remain to do. So is there any questions? That's basically the introduction to iBind. I'll just see if I can switch off my camera for now before I just quickly talk about the state of the art. Does anyone have any questions? Martin, you've got a hand up.
From Martin, yes.
Yeah, just very briefly, it goes right back to the beginning. There's some historical material from Northeast America that Dan's got in pine, and I've got a load that's undated from Newfoundland, but I mean, that's fairly small fry.
So Brendan Buckley recently has published a blue intensity white spruce chronology from Labrador. So it's not quite Newfoundland, but climatologically they may be coherent enough. So if it's white spruce, it all depends. I mean, you can actually cross-date different species with each other if the climate signal, right, that is represented by the parameters is similar. So summer temperatures. So if you've got a different species like, I don't know, black spruce or some weird pine, then we've done tests between, say, Sitka spruce and Scots pine in Scotland. And as long as the Sitka spruce is high elevation, then they cross-date very well. Well, reasonably well, right? It's Sitka spruce, right? It's like a weed, but it's still cross-dates. Any other questions? Cool. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about the state of the art. Yeah, Alma.
Do you have any experience with Taxus baccata?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Do you have any experience with Taxus baccata?
You mean yew trees?
Yeah.
Where do you want me to start? No. The first project I did in Scotland back in 2007, before blue, it wasn't a blue project, but we broke a lot of corers on yew trees. So my experience is more pain rather than a blue thing. But to be honest, so the Taxa baccata sites, the yew tree sites we sampled in Scotland, cross-date with the ringwidth quite well with the pine. So I don't see why blue wouldn't provide some information. The color of yew is very odd, right? And it's a beautiful wood. And it's more than one color, right? It's not just like a dark heartwood and a light sapwood. It has lots of other colors. So I would bet you a beer that there would be some signal in the late wood, but whether you can get meaningful low frequency from yew, it depends what your usage is, right? But I have samples from Scotland if you want them. But I will never call yew trees ever again. Unless...
We have samples, we have discs actually, so it's fine for the sampling. Now we have to, I was just thinking if it's worth to look at for blue intensity. But...
I can honestly hand on heart say that every conifer species I've worked with, there has been some signal in the blue. Now, sometimes for some species, it's not much different to the ringwidth, but that's a very small minority. Usually the latewood blue has an enhanced year-to-year signal. I'm being very careful here with the high frequency versus low frequency. Low frequency we can come to, but, you know, depending on your, yeah.
If I can join the discussion, yeah, it's doable. We made the test But it's, yeah, there is almost impossible to extract the color from hardwood. So low frequency signal would be really disturbed by this, but for high frequency, you have really nice blue intensity measurements. So it depends on your goal. Or you can try statistically remove the difference between hardwood and sapwood.
Thanks.
It's worth to try.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, that's the nice thing here is that at least with the blue method, it is cheap. You're not going to, it's a great student project, if nothing else, you know, so it's, you know, don't send it to the wood anatomist and they spend 6 months measuring all the wood anatomy and then the U doesn't show anything. You can actually probably get some idea from the blue. I see Holger smiling, but, you know, honestly, when we were doing the Australian work, and actually we were working on species, and Kathy Allen had measured with the SilverScan system a lot of wood anatomy, and a lot of it was meaningless and noisy, right? And then when we measured the blue, then the blue kind of agreed with the wood anatomy. So then we suddenly realized, well, let's first measure the blue, and then you decide what species might be the best to target if climate is your focus. If climate is your focus, right? You might have other reasons. Any other questions? Okay, so I quickly move on to the state of the art to restart. And I'm probably already over time. I apologize. Okay, so I'm going to really focus on dendroclimatology and briefly historical dating. There's really very little done on the ecological side, but I think people need to be aware that there is probably a huge amount of potential with using both ring width and blue intensity, and of course other parameters to get ecological information as well. Okay, so first, published reconstructions. If you look at Ricky's and our paper, that's got all a list of all the papers, but published climate reconstructions or papers that have explored the climate signal in blue are now everywhere, pretty much. Europe, Scandinavia, Alps, Pyrenees, Spain. That means southern Spain, Poland, Scotland, and then in the US, we've got anywhere from New Mexico all the way up to Alaska now. Canadian work is British Columbia, Labrador, Yukon, some dots in the center as well, Manitoba. And then we go across to Asia and Australasia. We've got low latitude, really tropical material from Vietnam, from Brendan Buckley's work, New Zealand and Australia, which is currently in press or in review at the moment with my work. So, you know, this really does show that kind of, you know, and wood anatomy and density would do the same, but, you know, across the planet, these data are showing a climate signal, and a climate signal that is significantly better than what we would get from ring width, right? So that's the crucial thing to first start off. And we've also, although it's not published yet, there's some really interesting results coming from Argentina in the next 12 months, I guess. So I'm just going to very slightly biased to my influence, I guess, but this is some latest work from the Yukon. This is an area, and I choose this purely because the ring width data in this part of the Yukon and basically all the way from southern Canada all the way up to the northern Yukon, the ring width data is a poor proxy for summer temperatures. There are instabilities in the climate signal, whether you call it divergence or not, but clearly you cannot really use ring width to reconstruct climate. We've done some exploratory work creating networks of blue intensity, and the calibrations are pretty good, at least since the 1950s, when the climate data is good for this area. And we focus mainly on living sites at the moment, and then the error increases as we go further back. We've only got one low elevation site that's probably not that temperature sensitive, but you can see the calibration is very good. And when we look at the spatial imprint of that, whether you're looking at non-transformed data or first difference data, clearly it expresses the summer temperatures. You know, these dark reds here are correlations of around 50% variance explained here. Okay, so this is a really strong calibration with a spatial imprint. I started off with spruce here because I wanted to highlight Karen Heater's work here. So she's a PhD student of Grant Harley in the University of Idaho. Over the last 3 or 4 years, they have been sampling a network of Engelmann spruce chronologies So my early master's work and British blue work in British Columbia up here, this has sort of created a network here we've got now going again from New Mexico right up into Idaho. And the calibration in all examples are pretty good. There's a couple of sites where the blue slightly diverges, but on the whole, the calibrations are really, really amazing and consistent with what we've been finding with spruce, from Engelmann spruce and white spruce all the way up into Alaska. The biggest issue, and Richard and Milos will talk about this, is the heartwood-sapwood color change, what I call the conundrum of how we get around this issue. Any color change that isn't climate related is going to impact. And I've got to really focus on Jesper Borklund's word from his PhD, his papers in 2014 and 2015. He came up with the concept of the delta blue parameter, where basically the assumption is that in the low frequency, both the early wood blue and the late wood blue show a common color change of darker heartwood versus lighter sapwood. So if you basically take the difference between the two parameters, that effectively removes that common trend, and then you are left with a year-to-year signal that hopefully has some climate relevance. Now, there is some confusion in how this is derived here, depending on what software you're using, Windendro versus Q-Recorder, but basically both approaches will lead to the same values. But this is one of the minor methodological confusions that I think are in the literature at the moment. My first exploration of the DB parameter, we were working with Hemlock in the Gulf of Alaska with Greg Wiles. Hemlock has a gradational change in the heartwood sapwood. This is just a very single example here, going from a darker heartwood, gradual change into the lighter sapwood here. And this is the early wood blue. That's the maximum reflectance. And then this is the late wood blue. Again, this is was not inverted at this time. And you can see they both show a relatively similar common long-term trend from darker reflectance into lighter reflectance. And then the difference between the two is this delta blue parameter at the bottom here. This is just for a single tree, but now you can see that there is no systematic change related to the heartwood-sapwood issue. Now, in this example here, because this was the first time I really played with the delta blue parameter, we created two reconstructions. One was focused on the late wood blue parameter, which is kind of the work that worked very well with spruce, those species that don't have a heartwood-sapwood color change, and then the delta blue. So if you actually look at the calibration period in the 20th century and then the validation period in the 19th century, statistically, there's not much difference between the two reconstructions. Arguably, even the late wood blue marginally calibrates a little bit stronger. It's not perfect. There are some issues with autocorrelation and so forth, but they do a reasonably good job. What is important to highlight, though, is that when we get into the Little Ice Age, then the expressions of temperature estimates are very different. Going back, where basically the late wood blue expresses relatively warm conditions, where the delta blue expresses relatively cold conditions. Now, notice that the early instrumental data here, even going into the 19th century, was not able to distinguish which of these two variants of the reconstruction were correct. Now, the reality is the late wood blue we can hypothesize is the one that's biased, because that one is basically you've got darker heartwood, lighter sapwood. We've inverted the data. That's what the inversion here is. So that darker reflectance is now giving us relatively warm estimates. But how can we actually test that? We were lucky. Greg Wiles is actually a glaciologist rather than a dendroclimatologist. And we had not only independent ring width-based reconstructions from the Gulf of Alaska, but we also had history of dated glacial advance in the Gulf of Alaska region. And for glacial advance, you must have cold conditions. So this whole period of prolonged cooling through the Little Ice Age right up until the end of the 19th century coincided nicely with periods and pulses of glacial expansion in the region. And clearly the warm estimates from the late wood blue clearly don't fit with that paradigm. What is important about this record is that this was just a preliminary analysis we did back a few years ago, but this delta blue record now, so that's this one here, now goes back to the 3rd century. And we clearly pick up, say, for example, the 6th century cold periods, I think the late antique, Little Ice Age or whatever Ulf Buntgen would call it. You know, so this is becoming, and it will become, an important temperature record when finally it is published in the coming years. I think Greg doesn't want to publish it until he's got the full 2,000 years. I know Mauricio's in the virtual room. I've got to talk about Mauricio's. This is the longest Delta Blue reconstruction, I think, that is currently published. It's from Scandinavia. We're looking at phenomenally good calibrations, 64% of the variance explained. And bar that there were some adjustments with regards to the snag material, so the surface preserved darker wood material. There were issues with regards to coloration. This is a beautiful record and really shows the potential of the blue intensity parameter for climatology. You know, and this to me is, you know, this shows that it can be done, right? And you can talk about resolution issues in the scanners and so forth, but even with all of those potential problems, you know, these data do a pretty good job. Emily Reed, my PhD student, and I, we just literally, on a random holiday in the Pyrenees, I illegally sampled a pine chronology up in the Pyrenees. We wrote up a small little paper. There is no statistical difference between the Delta Blue chronology and the density chronologies in the region around where we're sampling. They have similar statistical properties and so forth. So again, Delta Blue is doing a pretty good job for those species where you get that strong heartwood sapwood discoloration. Milos Rydval and his PhD, we at that time, we weren't working with Delta Blue. We approached the problem in a slightly different way. We did a sort of bandpass approach where the low frequency was driven from the ring width data and the high frequency was driven by the Lakewood Blue, and we just combined them in a spectral sense. This was a very nice reconstruction, explained, I don't know, 56% of the variance. But since then, we have now reprocessed all the samples. Well, basically, we've just pressed the button and we've generated Delta Blue for many, many more sites around Scotland. And this is a comparison of Milos's original reconstruction in blue. And then the red line is the Delta Blue equivalent for Scotland. And the black data is just the instrumental data. And I want to highlight this is the Delta Blue, again, a bit like Fuentes' Mauricio's reconstruction from Scandinavia, is explaining basically 64% of the variance and is again doing a phenomenal job from this Delta Blue parameter. Now, just to finish off, you know, we're talking about state of the art. So this is not, I thought, well, just for today, and I was madly doing this morning, if we take the Delta Blue data and the maximum density data from central Sweden, so this is either Jämtland for density and Rogan, that's Fuentes' reconstruction from Rogan, and then the density and the blue data from Scotland and the Pyrenees, if we combine them, we could come up with a simple reconstruction for Western Europe, I guess, or much of Europe. What does it look like? Well, that's what they look like. So red is the density, blue is the Delta Blue composite, for, and then the black line is the June, July, August mean temperatures for Europe. So the Delta Blue from this simple exercise here is explaining 62% of the variance, where the density is explaining 56% of the variance. Now, this is maybe not the fairest comparison. I think Jämtland and Rogan are probably similar, but in Scotland, the density data is not as good as the Delta Blue because we haven't measured as much density data. But likewise, in the Pyrenees, the density data from Ulf Buntgen's reconstruction is way more replicated than the one blue site that we generated for that paper. But it really highlights the potential for Delta Blue. And I really do not accept when people tell me, oh, you know, the Delta Blue doesn't work, right? It does work. The evidence is there. The question is then, how do we actually push these reconstructions back? How do we counter or factor in all the limitations that Richard and Milos are going to talk about? And I should highlight here, just look at the 1816 here, right? Both these parameters are expressing a slightly different story with regards to Tambora and the impact of climate in Europe at that time. And it's almost a degree difference. So which is actually correct, the density, or is the Delta Blue parameter slightly too sensitive? We don't know, right? But that's the sort of things we need to explore. Okay, very quickly with historical dating, a couple of slides here. The blue, there's almost no, it's a no-brainer that because the climate signal in blue is going to be so much cleaner, especially when we've got a few samples together, that of course the blue is going to enhance the dating. Okay, and we've had tests in Scotland, Poland, Spain, and the Eastern Alps already. Kurt Nicolussy's work in the Eastern Alps. So some early work was published about 4 years ago. This is Scotland again. Sorry for my biases, but this is the data I know. We've split Scotland roughly into 5 regions: Northwest, South, West Central, Southwest, Northern Cairngorms, and the southern Cairngorms. And then I took 4 independent chronologies, and then we just tested how, if we created a sort of mythical building chronology. So we took these sites, reduced the number of samples to about anywhere from 6 to 10. We shortened them all to have a rough mean sample length of 80 years, which is kind of representative of the crappy buildings we have in Scotland. And then how does the ring width and the blue date? So this is focusing on the Lakewood dating and the ring width dating. And the green line here is basically the t-value of 4 that we put as a minimum threshold. And you can see for each of these 4 sites, for these periods, the blue gives us a much stronger t-value, so a bigger probabilistic hit with regards to the dating. And actually the provenancing is actually also correct for at least the 3 sites that were within these regions here with regards to where these data came from. So the blue also helps with the provenancing as well as the ring width data. Okay, so that was a fairly easy test, but these results are based on a network of temperature sensitive trees that of course I've sampled for climate purposes. What happens when growth is not limited by temperature, meaning what happens at different elevations? So again, we've done a lot of transect work at the moment, and we're really trying to understand what's happening in the lower elevations in Scotland. So this is just 3 sites in 1 elevation of transect. We've got 3 that's in development, but going from basically the temperature limitation zone right down to sea level, where, well, things are a bit different. And now you can see that when we go from the 300 meters down to basically sea level, that the t-values and between the blue and the ring width slowly get closer. And by the time we're at sea level, then we really can't date the low elevation material using the high elevation material. Now, that's not a surprise. We've lost the temperature response, and it probably does explain why we're having some dating problems with some of the buildings in Scotland. It's not just the fact that we've got short sequences, is that some of the material is coming from low elevations. But we've got other parameters we can measure now, right? We can measure the delta blue. We can also measure the Earlywood blue. Do these parameters change? Well, actually, no. For the 2 high elevation sites, the Lakewood blue all the time gives us the better result. Okay, and Earlywood is maybe at high elevation slightly better than ring width, but certainly quite poor at the mid elevations. But we go to low elevations, and then all of a sudden the low elevation material dates quite well with the high elevation composite chronologies or the regional chronologies for the Earlywood parameter. Now, I can't explain that at this time, but what it does highlight though is we've got to be really careful with our reference chronologies, is getting reference chronologies derived that's relevant to the elevations and the different ecological situations and the climatological situations that we're targeting and where the material may come from. Now, if I use a low elevation reference chronology, then of course the t-values are going to be higher, right? But we are limited at low elevations to plantation material, so it's very hard to build long chronologies. So initially we actually need to use the long high elevation temperature sensitive chronologies to date the low elevation material before we can start building those low elevation reference chronologies. So that's where we got. That's none of that's published yet, but will be forthcoming. Okay, I'm going to finish off the cons. Okay, we haven't really talked about this, but the signal, the relative common signal in blue is quite noisy at the tree level. Now that very quickly improves it when we add more food, but basically you do need more samples for blue than you would with density and certainly quantitative wood anatomy. Anything non-climatic that impacts the wood color will impact the blue intensity data. So that could be the heartwood sapwood color change that impacts low frequency, but we've got staining issues, whether it be algal staining, fungal staining, or even just material lying on the ground or being in a loch in a lake for a long time. We've got wormholes in historical material. How do you counter for a wormhole that's black or full of chalk, wood dust, cracks, and all of these issues can impact the blue. So we've got to be very careful how we measure around these areas where there's discoloration. On the pro side, well, let's first, it's cheap and easy to measure, right? The signal strength actually does quickly improve once we start increasing replication. So if we need 10 trees for density, okay, if we need 20 trees for blue, does that really matter, seeing we can measure so much more quickly? I don't think so. It is a method available to all, at least the way we're using it at the moment. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, whether it's be a climatological or for historical dating and provenancing, the focus really now it should be on creating these blue networks. This will enhance all of these aspects that we want to do, whether it's understanding spatial aspects of climate or provenancing. And because it's cheap and easy, we can do that relatively quickly. All the labs, many labs are sitting on conifer material and reference chronologies, you know, and okay, we need funding to do that. But still, once the funding is there, it won't take long to do. Right. That's my state-of-the-art talk. I will stop pontificating now. Before we go on to Ricky and Milos, any questions? Yes, April.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily have a question, but it kind of, so I'm from University of Idaho, so my advisor is also Grant Harley, who you mentioned earlier, work with Karen and everything. And they are out in the field and wanted to come to the meeting, but they weren't able to because they're out in the Bitterroots right now, but just wanted to vouch for their Western and Eastern blue intensity networks that they're working on. And they were just kind of wanted me to let everybody know about it. And if you guys have questions you can feel free to email me. I guess my email is weirdly in my name title. I don't know how to get rid of that. I'm not familiar with Teams. So, but if anybody has questions, you can feel free to email me and I can forward you guys to either Grant Harley or Karen Heater. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, Grant and your group there are really, there's a whole mass of blue intensity chronologies in the US that are being developed now. In the recent Yellowstone reconstruction, that's another one. Actually, I forgot to say that's actually 2 1,000-year reconstructions now. I should have shown that as well. You know, and you know that actually started in the 2017 Dendroecological Field Week. I was doing a blue group there, and I was giving Megan a hard time and saying, "Well, you've got to measure blue on this stuff. Don't waste your time on density." And they've done it, right? So you know they've got a really nice record. You know.
I just had to double check the number, but yeah, Grant said that they have over 85 sites now for chronologies, and so they're making some really good progress, which is awesome.
It's great.
Yeah.
I think Mike. Hi, how you doing, Mike?
Hi. Yeah, I have to leave shortly, but I wanted to throw in a couple of comments about standardization and protocols that your talk made me think about. One was the idea of this Heartwood transition, and I wonder if it's possible color-wise to define for a given sample what that color is, and then digitally subtract it out. That might be a way to get at the standardization problem. The other thing I wanted to mention was in terms of like all reporting on the same blue intensity scale, it might be valuable to create a standard, and the standard doesn't have to actually be have any reality to it. It just needs to be a standard. So just to take like an example, and this is what we do in stable isotope measurements, for instance. The standards don't exist, but we all report them on the same scales. So, you know, maybe it's a scanner at, just to choose an example, a scanner at 600 DPI. So if you have a 1200 DPI scanner or a 150 DPI scanner, you report it as if it were a 600 DPI image, and then all the data can be combined together. I apologize for the artificial and overly simplistic example, but do you see what I generally mean?
No, well, I mean, Richard, if you're still here for Richard's talk, I mean, in a way, we do have a standardized, theoretically, there is a color calibration step, right, to a color card. We're all on a standard, the data is on a standard scale from 0 to 255. And actually, when Jesper did his intercomparison project, and Richard's done one as well, actually the blue intensity data was much more coherent in the raw data than the density data were. And the density people theoretically have a standard, right, with wedges and so forth. So I'm not saying it's disastrous, but there's actually hasn't been a community discussion about, okay, this is how we standardize it. We're not that far off because, of course, most of the scanners are standardized. But as soon as you start using a digital camera on a microscope, then color calibration becomes quite tricky. So, yeah, it's hear you completely.
Okay, so you're already doing all these things, and it's just a matter of just demonstrating it through an intercomparison study. Okay, I really apologize. I have to go now, but this was really fun. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.
Right, if there's no other questions, then I'll pass on to Richard.
Hello. It's my turn. I hope I will be brief. Just let me know if you can see the presentation.
We can see it. Yeah.
Yes? Okay. So thank you, Rob, for fantastic presentation. It's my turn to add some grain of salt to this, or some reasons to feel blue, but also sometimes what to do about it. And I would like to start linking today's meeting with yesterday's presentations, because I'm stealing one slide from Alan Crivellaro, and this is really inspiring what he showed us yesterday, the learning curve, how we proceed with our research. So it's hard to say where we are on this curve, each of us just now concerning blue intensity, but I'm sure that in beginning of 2000s we are all clueless because it was not any work done on this. Maybe we are very optimistic because we don't know what we don't know. Maybe we are discouragingly realistic, or maybe we are already having some big progress. But my job today now is to bring all us down and see that cynical old grumpy man has something critics to share with you. And there are actually 5 points that I want to mention. There is much more. Some of them were already raised, so I will not talk about some of them, but this is something which I find important. So first, we don't know what we are measuring. This is kind of big thing. The method protocols are biased. We are using absolute tools. We know little about how we can compare blue intensity with density, and there is a lack of blue intensity applications for other studies besides dendroclimatology. And I would like to elaborate a bit on this. And the first point is that we don't really know what we are measuring. And we need to go back to the first publication by McCarroll et al. And they made this first, as Rob already showed us, research, how to use light reflected from surface of the wood to measure some parameters. And they found that blue channel of visible light reacts the best to the changes of the wood surface. But if you check carefully, there is not big difference between blue, green, and red channel, or in even ultraviolet. And I don't know any further research which really broader this, and no one really tested this again. We just follow the initial results that blue is the best for that. And also we had really nice explanation why it's like that, because blue reflection, it's strongly associated with wood density, and wood density is related to the lignin cellulose and hemicellulose content in the cell walls. And again, this was never tested. It's a good explanation, makes sense, but we never practically make any steps to prove or disprove that. And of course, this holds water when we talk about late wood blue intensity. So bigger or denser cell walls for the late wood gives us higher values of blue intensity or reverse blue intensity. But if we think about early blue intensity, early wood blue intensity, this doesn't make sense. So there is something missing here. And only very recently, Björklund et al., they propose alternative explanation that not really the content of the cell walls, but the geometry of the cells, cell wall area and lumen area are important for both density and blue intensity. So not the chemistry is important, but geometry. And I think that this is very simple and elegant explanation, but again, this is just beginning of research, and we need much more studies to really prove that this is the case. The next problem that we have is with our protocols, and actually there are two protocols published, and one is from 2011, one is from 2014. So again, you have seen this already. So Campbell published protocol how to use blue intensity for wind and draw, and Rydval et al. Focus more on Curie recorder. But what is similar for both is that they are based on one species. It's Scott pine, and they are both based on the samples from similar region. And as you can see on this graph above, now we have like 50% of the publications based on this one species, but when we work with other species, we cannot really rely so much on their work. And don't take me in the wrong way. This is a very good work, and they both explore a lot of details how to produce, how to generate blue intensity. But we need to be careful by applying their advices on other species. So all what we have, the protocol described with chemical treatment, preparing the surface, scanning, even measuring, are something which we can call Scott pine / Scandinavian / temperature-driven growth method. So we need to be careful when we apply this protocol to other species, other environments. And what if you have broadleaf species, and we can use blue intensity for broadleaf species wood? So this needs completely revised protocol. But of course, I would like to present you also with positive examples. So here we have publication already again mentioned because it's not so many examples. So this is paper by Buckley et al. And they work with completely different place, different species. So they were forced to figure out how to use early wood blue intensity more than late wood blue intensity, but they took their time to understand better the ecophysiological perspective of their work, and they had really good results because of that. So when you are careful and you pay attention to details, you can have, even with something which in the beginning looks very difficult, excellent results. The next problem that we have is all digital tools that we use. And here we can kind of choose between very luxurious and expensive equipment. And of course, we would love to have it. And something which usually dominates in our lab. So we can dream of Tesla, but we are more using Skoda in our labs. But it's not big problem as long as we are aware about the limitations of that. So when we are using normal scanners, we need to understand how they work, what's the maximum density, the maximum resolution that we can get from this tool, and also how we store our sample, our images. So here we have still most of the images stored in 8-byte mode of the color registration, while most of the digital world is dominated by much higher resolution. So both this has to be addressed in some way, and ideally we want to move to higher resolution in both means. And software, because it's not only hardware that we use, but also software. And here we have actually quite good situation, because most of us use QRecorder. And again, Rob already mentioned this. This is very good tool for dendrochronology, and especially for blue intensity. So we should support work of Lars Åke as much as possible, and secure that he could work with us for a longer period. This is important because this person, it's kind of institution. He really interacts with dendrochronologies and really helps us to explore new possibilities of blue intensity. But we need to remember that this is not only one way to do it. We have different softwares, and they offer different ways of measuring blue intensity. So QRecorder is very, very cool, but it's not the ultimate tool for the blue intensity. We can sometimes have very interesting results using, for example, WinDendro in not very classical way. And this is publication from Babs et al. From 2016. They analyze intra-annual wood density fluctuations based on blue intensity using WinDendro, the feature which is very unique for this particular software. And the next thing is that we always compare blue intensity to X-ray density. For the very first publication, there is this tendency to use this alternative proxy, that the blue intensity is surrogate for density, but we really know not a lot about the relation between these two parameters. But here I would like to mention that it's not always the problem with blue intensity. Sometimes we rely too much of density derived from classical X-ray measurements. So maybe the blame is not always on our side. But anyway, we need to explore this, and the main goal would be to be able always to compare these two measurements and use this together. And something which is kind of interesting, it's more observation, it's that there is really little work of blue intensity applications outside of dendroclimatology. So Rob already presented his work on archaeology, but as you saw, it's a lot of dendroclimatology in his archaeological paper. There is one other which I was able to find from Arbelay and all on butmorph defoliation, and they use both ring width and blue intensity to detect the outbreaks, and apparently blue intensity was better tool. But this is actually the really only one dendroecological work that I was able to find which use blue intensity as a main tool. And the question is why? And maybe the answer is that we have not really so well developed tool, and people are not keen to use it, and we are focused too much on climatology, and we don't really talk about how to share this method with other branches of tree ring research. But anyway, this is a short list, and I mentioned these problems not to discourage you from working with blue intensity, and not to stay too much in this bottom part of the learning curve, and we create this event that we want to share our knowledge, we want to teach each other, and we want to work together. So overcoming these problems, it's always easier and better when we work together and we create a community and we have international network that we can learn from each other. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Ricky. Any questions, anyone?
I don't have a question, but also we are also working with blue rings, and this is recently work in a paper where we compare different blue rings and MXD and blue intensity, and we can confirm that not always we have Lakewood MXD and the blue rings. So, and this is all mainly depends if blue rings are also light rings, but I confirm what also Jesper said, that blue intensity probably doesn't catch the lignin in the cell wall.
Yes, for sure.
Which actually it's quite good news. I don't know if you ever tried to measure lignin content of the cell walls. So this is very difficult.
Yeah, we try with the Raman Raman spectroscopy, but we unfortunately the species we used that was Pinus uncinata is not really the best species for Raman spectroscopy because there was a lot of Pinus sylvine that masked the signal of the lignin. So there is definitely space to investigate more on this prospect with this technique.
Yeah, that's true. But also what I wanted to say, it's much easier to. I'm not expert on this, but I imagine that it's much easier to make quantitative wood anatomy than measure lignin content. So we can have better results and more precise results with wood anatomy. So it's good. Actually, it's good news for us that it's not chemistry; it's geometry of the cells. And I think that Holger wanted to add something.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think that it's really chemistry, because when I started thinking about MXD, I asked a few years ago, I asked Fritz Schreingruber, what are you measuring there? And he simply said, so I don't know. I don't care, you know? And so what you use for calibration is cellulose. Yeah. So you're all talking about lignin now, but why should lignin be the chemical component which is controlling MXD? So what I did, I did some MXD measurements on samples here at WSL, and I used the same samples for wood anatomy and calculating the density based on the cell sizes. And I got almost the same results. So the chemistry is not controlling density, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
we could maybe we could use these samples to check for blue intensity.
Yeah, of course. Now, as we emphasize, it's not difficult to measure. So if you want to compare your results with blue intensity, just send it to one of us. Yeah. Or scan it and measure for yourself. We can instruct you how to do it. You just missed the workshop. But anyway, so yeah, it's more and more evidence. It's this one publication from Jesper, but you have your own experience, something which was not published, and during this discussion we can confirm that it's more not the structure, the chemical structure of the cell walls, but the size of the cell walls and the lumena, which is important. But you know, I think it's something that, as Fritz said, and it's not so important, the details, when you measure hundreds of samples and you make correlation with climate. Rob showed us that this works. But at one point, we need to understand why and what we are actually measuring. So this is why I put this as a first problem, that at one point, it's worth to re-examine our knowledge and improve on it if it's possible.
I should say that Danny was at the workshop, so Danny is a blue specialist now.
That's true.
Yeah. So he says he's going to get, just check out all the hardware for densitometry and wood anatomy and just do blue now. I think he might have been joking, but Christina has a question. We'll just go through the list. Christina?
Okay, yeah.
Yes, but this guy
doesn't sound like Christina.
It's not Christina.
He doesn't look like Christina.
Yeah, so, well, I have to just agree with Alma and Holger that I think it's the cell dimensions that drive the density or the blue intensity. And also mention that we did some, or not me, but colleagues of mine did some Raman on the density comparison material for 5 trees, and just to check the lignin cellulose ratio, if that had any R-bar or temperature signal or anything. And there appears to be very little signal at all. No common signal between the trees, and very scattered climate signals, if any. So I think that also sort of supports the idea that we are actually measuring the relationship between the cell wall and the entire trachea surface area. So,
yeah. I mean, thank you very much. And I mean, we need to remember that Raman spectrometer, it's not really ideal way to measure lignin. It's the fastest, but there are more time-consuming but more precise methods, and I don't even remember how it is, but not all of the Raman spectrometers, they able to measure lignin directly. So we also do some tests on this on large samples, which were already measured for density, and there is no signal. So yeah, it's the same. It's just that probably at one point would be good to share this with community.
I mean, there was a paper earlier than Macarel actually that measured lignin in one of the cell walls and compared that to MXD, and they were not even correlated. So there is evidence to not support that lignin is driving the blue intensity earlier even than Macarel. So
yeah, I think that we all agree on this. Finally.
I think Georg is next.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Right. So I don't know where to start. It's a very interesting discussion, but maybe just on this, I mean, when it's about cellulose or lignin, I mean, what do we measure with blue intensity? It's a color, right? It's not any fancy chemical analysis where we look inside or we measure something like dimensions. No, it's just the color of the wood surface. Now, the wood surface has a pale yellowish appearance. No wonder it's the blue intensity and not the green intensity that gives the best contrast. Have you ever decomposed a core image into its color channels? Well, maybe you try this and you will see it's the blue channel that gives the best contrast. This is why it's called the blue intensity. However, of course, any other channel should provide some similar information. That's also clear. It cannot be just the opposite. And this is maybe just a small input from the image analysis. So I put on my image analysis hat here. Well, it's color, and it cannot be more than color, right? Nothing fancy, it's color, which is good enough, it seems. It's very strong, apparently. Well, maybe still I add, since there is silence, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if we would like to check lignin content, of course, we would need longer time series. I think that was the beauty of what Jesper did in this paper. It was a long enough time series with sufficient replication to really show that, well, it's not most likely not a lignin content or any property of the cell wall material that matters, but it's the dimensions, right? I think that is the nice thing, because also with Raman, obviously it's very time consuming, even if Richard says there is even more precise ways, but still with Raman to build up a significant time series, forget it, right?
Yeah, that's true.
If I may interfere here, you say it's color, just color, and I think at the end it's color, but basically what is behind the color? So not talking about the lignin, but about the cellulose. And these cellulose strings building up the cell walls, they have different angles, you know? And depending on the angle of these microfibrils, you have a different reflection on the surface when you cut it. And this could also influence the color then you receive. So I think the lignin is more or less constant, but the cellulose content and the angle of the microfibrils, this could alter the reflectance of light of the surface, you know? And this could be a topic, but this could be easily analyzed if you go for, let's say, a compression wood where you have a different angle, definitely, and compare compression wood cells with common cells and see if there's a difference in blue or not. And if there is a difference, then you should go for these different angles there.
I think, sorry to interject here, but I think that the cellulose, if you purify that, that's white, and that will give you sort of a maximum reflection. And the color cell wall is actually brown, and that's the contrast between the brown cell wall and the white lumina that is filled with sawdust or even chalk that gives the sort of dimensions to the measurements. So if we measure the cellulose that is white, it's going to be the same color as the lumina, and that will not give us the relationship that we want.
But it's not only the cellulose, also the cellulose, the microfibrils, and contain also these other substances. And at the end, depending if the light is going straight on the surface of these strings or oblique, you might have a difference in reflectance. This is the point, you know.
This is the reason why we so much appreciate the CUNET people are here. Milos was raising his hand.
Yes. Yeah, just to kind of, the conversation has moved on a little bit, but I sort of wanted to more or less second what Georg was saying there before. But I think it's an interesting discussion now about what exactly are we measuring, and you know if we're to talk about the relative proportion of the components that are making up the cell wall, that's one thing. But I think maybe Holger has an interesting point here with the orientation of the microfibrils and how that might potentially be changing maybe some of these properties or affecting some of these properties that we're measuring. But in general, I just wanted to actually add one point about maybe this, I guess, confusion in the literature about the potential role of lignin. And I think this kind of goes back to a series of papers that looked into light absorption or UV and UV absorption of lignin, which, if I understand, is supposed to be quite strong. And then I think there were one or two studies that tried to relate lignin content. I don't remember the name right now. Kindle et al. 2000, which looked at through UV microscopy, identifying looking at the relationship between lignin content and the terminal latewood tracheids, and how this relates to summer and early autumn temperatures. So I guess then, you know, from the results of the McCarroll paper, where there was sort of this very strong response in the blue light, we just kind of made that jump that, okay, this is what we are measuring, what's kind of controlling the density, even without really very strong evidence. So I think now it's quite interesting with, you know, Jesper's work that you know, it might not really be such a big issue, and really it might just be worth just focusing on the physical dimensions, or the actual dimensions of the wood structure, rather than you know, the actual cell wall components in this case. And just the second point I wanted to make, Richard, you mentioned that there are really very few studies that use blue intensity outside of the dendroclimatic context. And you're right. I think I just in one paper just kind of tried to throw blue in as a contrast to ring width in relation to disturbance and more of an ecological context. So that's been touched on a little bit, but certainly now I'm aware of at least 1 or 2 papers that will be coming out, which look in more detail at this relation between this environmental disturbances and blue intensity data and ring width and other parameters. And we're trying to work on something similar in a environmental pollution context in north of the Czech Republic. So hopefully there will be more of these papers coming out, and I'll try to encourage others to do the same and explore blue intensity in this context as well. I think there's a lot of potential, and of course in archaeology, there's a lot more to be done. So, yeah.
Suran has a question. Thanks, Milos. Suran?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Greetings from Mongolia. Sorry, it's kind of dark here because we are out of the city because of the pandemic. So I'm using my phone to contact you or get in the meeting. So if there is any background noise, sorry about that. So I have just one question regarding the preparing the samples for the blue intensity, because I have to say that previously we used the sending all the samples by hand or the machine, but now we bought the microtome from the Holger Gardner. So hello, in personally. So for the blue intensity sample preparation, is there any, I have to say, protocol or like a preferred preparation for the course for the blue intensity, if you have any suggestions?
I mean, certainly what you need to do is to prepare flat surface.
Yes.
So fit well with the scanner, and you need to cut or polish your samples in a way that you can clearly see the ring boundaries. And if you have binocular, check, because it's better if you see cell walls. If you have the cell wall structure, I mean cell walls visible, it's good enough. And you can use chalk to increase the contrast.
Yeah.
Or if you just polish your samples, use the high-grade sanding paper, so the sawdust fill the lumina.
Yeah, if I might just add, you
if you are interested in details, you just contact one of us, and you will get the really detailed instruction. Or you can use really some fancy stuff, and Milos will explain you how to do it now.
Yeah, just the only thing when using the microtome, you will basically just need something to fill in the lumina so that you actually you can then actually scan this and measure blue intensity on this. So as Richard mentioned, either something like chalk, or then actually you could just take sawdust and kind of work that in if you want something that's more similar to what most people are measuring right now. But
it's a really good point, because if you're sanding, then you fill in the lumina with the wood, right?
Yes.
Now Kurt Nicolucci is lurking. I can see him. He does do a microtome, and then he uses a chalking approach, so he can distinguish between the late wood and the early wood much better, because basically you are filling in the lumen with the wood, which is some of its late wood. So you actually, it's not disastrous. I mean, you've seen the results, but if you really want to distinguish early wood and late wood, then the chalking approach arguably is. I'm seeing Holger nodding. Milos and
go for the highest contrast.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
The only question I have for Kurt is that I don't know how you standardize the process of filling in the lumen. You know, but that might be a wider question.
Yeah. Depending what you use, you can fill the lumina of the cells with chalk for best, and thereafter you have to cut it again to remove the chalk from the cell walls. Not just filling them, polishing them, and then measure. Yeah, you have to fill it and then cut it again slightly, and then you can use it.
I thought you licked it. I thought licking was enough.
Good.
Sorry, there's too many Germans in the room. No jokes allowed.
It's okay. I have because I have bad experience with the cutting the cars, the spruce cars with the microtome. So now I have
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. So.
Holger, just one point. Actually, we're right now using a very fine sort of chalk powder for sort of lab purposes, and there we seem to kind of get away with not recutting the surface again with the microtome, and basically it's so fine that it gets inside, but then you just kind of wipe off the surface with just a finger or something, and it does not really seem to. It basically on the surface it seems to disappear. So I guess maybe also the type of chalk or the maybe grain size or the structure might also be important in this.
Yes. But if you want to be sure that you remove it from the cell wall, you have to cut it a little. Huh?
Cool. Well, thank you for that conversation. Yeah, well, greetings to Mongolia. There was actually Nicole Davy is publishing in GRL a paper of blue from Mongolian larch.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
And the results are really good, actually. So we just need to find the medieval. So, right. Oh, Milos, I nearly forgot you. So
yes.
We're well ahead. We're well behind schedule, but everyone's, we're relaxed.
We've already had quite an interesting discussion, so I think it's okay. Right. Shall I share my screen? I'll try not to spend too much time on. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. I will try not to repeat too much of what Rob and Richard have said already, but in general, I try to add on to what they've said by hopefully saying just a few words about blue intensity and some innovations, and maybe where can we go from here. So I'll probably focus more on the methodological side of things, but in general, in relation to blue intensity and some of the issues that we're facing, a lot of this is, as you've already heard, related to the color or the reflectance properties of the wood, and when we have darker or lighter sections, for whatever reason, it may be the structure of the wood itself, the species that we're using, or any other sort of cause that anything else that causes discoloration on the surface of the wood, that basically presents an issue that we need to solve somehow. And common sort of series of techniques that have been explored is basically using various chemical treatment or resin extraction options and so on. So things like compounds like acetone, ethanol with a Soxhlet extractor extraction system, or other compounds like bleach and peroxide, for example. But again and again, what we seem to find is that these sort of color or brightness differences persist often, even after performing this kind of treatment. So that's seen, for example, in paper in Björklund's paper from 2014, where there was a marked improvement in sort of this color transition. However, some of these changes still persisted, and actually, even looking at things like subfossil wood, older preserved wood, these issues might become even more severe. I've looked into, also different ways of treating the wood, but again, at the end of the day, there's still you still have a discrepancy if you compare, for example, to density or other parameters that are purely related to the color properties of the wood. Another similar study, or another study that really looked at a whole range of different compounds and substances to basically treat subfossil wood, and basically was mainly interested in the iron, the dissolved iron from lake sediments, which was actually found its way into the wood, and then upon exposure to oxygen, it basically oxygenates and discolors the wood very severely. So again, another attempt to kind of correct for this using chemical treatment, but really in some ways imperfect, unfortunately. And so currently our best approach in the blue intensity sort of paradigm to correct these kind of color-related biases and issues is with Björklund's delta blue intensity correction. So the delta blue method, which Rob has already talked about and sort of discussed in some detail, but essentially using the early wood blue intensity value to correct the late wood blue intensity value, and in this way, sort of on a ring by ring basis to eliminate these sort of color changes. So in general, this is a great method and technique, but at the same time, there may be situations or results where this correction may be inadequate. Maybe Rob would disagree with that based on all the wonderful results from several studies, but I think that might be an interesting topic for discussion, actually, about the delta correction, how well it works or not. But in some cases, it can actually lead to overcorrection or, for example, introduction of noise as well. And really, the true test of this, I think, is in very, very long, sort of multi-centennial, millennial, or multi-millennial chronologies, if we have those. And I think really there might be it's necessary to explore this in more detail to really see what's happening. I would also maybe be a bit cautious with using density or maximum late wood density chronologies as sort of a standard to compare blue intensity against, especially on these very long timescales, because even the density data can have biases, long-term biases that, I think it's not really the optimal standard. And then, we can talk about looking at things like wood anatomy, which, or high-resolution wood anatomy data, which might maybe help with some of these questions, but it's a very tricky thing because with actual instrumental climate data, which we're using to really compare our chronologies against, that is very limited in a temporal sense. So what happens before that, it's a bit trickier to really get to the bottom of that. Another little limitation of the delta blue correction method is that really right now there isn't actually any clear way to correct early wood blue intensity values using this procedure. So another issue that I wanted to talk about is resolution. And this is really covered in quite a lot of detail in Jesper Björklund's paper from 2019, both in relation to density and blue intensity as well. And really here, what we see is sort of systematic biases in terms of, the resolution of the measuring equipment that we're using, and particularly in relation to very narrow rings, where it may actually be very difficult to accurately capture the properties or the sort of the maximum liquid density or the maximum blue intensity value of those very narrow rings. So there potentially can be a systematic bias when very small ringlet sizes are used, or when ringlet size is very small. And again, Richard has already sort of talked about this, but another one of Jesper's paper, more recently from 2021, about this idea that really lignin, the role of lignin, at least based on this study, appears to not really be significant in terms of determining or controlling the density of the cells of the wood, and really what we should be focusing on is the sort of the dimensions of the cell wall to non-cell or cell wall to lumen area in determining density and any of the parameters that are related to density, which we are measuring. And so this presents potentially a very interesting possible solution for color biases in relation to blue intensity, because then really all we need is a very good representation of the anatomical structure of the wood. And if we can do that just by looking at the surface of the wood rather than preparing slides, thin sections of the wood, then and then using that surface reflected light information to develop a blue intensity or blue intensity-like parameter, this could potentially bypass these color issues that we're having. So in general, then just to mention a little bit more about resolution. So we can go here from sort of the relatively easy, cheap to produce ringlet data on the left here, and go all the way, past blue intensity, all the way to density and width anatomy, where we see, we have this sort of trade-off between how easy it is to actually produce these data sets and the signal and the strength of the signals that we're able to obtain from that. And if we kind of zoom in here a little bit, you can see this limitation in relation to blue intensity with this is a highest sort of commercially available scanning resolution. And really, when you look at these very narrow rings, you see that the resolution issue is very clear. We don't have a lot of detail here. Of course, with the density or especially wood anatomy, then we do have this detail, but just generating these data sets, it's quite difficult and time consuming and can be costly as well. So I've really been wondering, can we find a middle ground here where we can actually use images of the sample surface in a way that allows us to, image the surface at very high resolution, and then just based on what we were talking about in relation to the not focusing so much on the components of the cell wall, but actually the relative proportions of cell wall to lumen area, can we actually develop a blue intensity like parameter based on this? So this is where some of you have heard this already. I presented a couple talks on this, but this sort of proposal or idea to have this new surface-based intensity parameter, SI parameter, which is based on a high-resolution binary representation of the tree rings and the wood structure. So this is just a part of our project, so just to kind of go through this, what we've been doing recently is basically trying to find the best way to take a sample and surface it as well as possible, so that we have a nice representation of what's actually happening on the anatomical level. And this, I won't go into the details, but essentially looking at both unstained and stained samples, we've been able to basically produce some very nice surfacing of these samples, which and then basically using very, very fine chalk to fill in the lumina, and then in some cases also using staining the samples to provide even more contrast, which then helps with the identification of the features of the wood. So here's one example of that. So basically using a microscope system with a camera and a mechanized sort of automated stage, it's possible to acquire a large number of images and basically prepare a composite image, which gives us a nice overview of what's happening, and then we can really look at the sample in a lot of detail, and then kind of work with it in the same way that we would treat a regular sample when measuring blue intensity. But before doing that, just a few images here. Before we can do that, actually, if we look at one section of this, sort of the surface of these microscope-based images, we start off with something like this, which is still a color image. You see there's some staining at the bottom and no staining at the top. The problem with this is that just using standard sort of normal light without any filter, without polarization in this case, it's really not optimal, and we don't really have adequate contrast that we would need. But by using polarized light, this really dramatically improves the contrast of the cell wall and lumen features. Then still taking a color image, so this darker stained section, then basically through a series of modification and image processing sort of procedures, we get to something that is a true binary representation of the surface of the sample. So you can see this here on a larger section, so the larger section going from color to binary. And here an example image. So really the key here is that we, in this way, by kind of using this binary image, it's not necessary to perform any type of color calibration or light calibration even when working with these samples. So looking at traditional blue intensity from a scanner-based system, we're really talking about measurements on scans that are somewhere around 2,400 dpi at best, if we're talking about true resolution of these kind of systems. With these high-resolution binary images or surface intensity sort of measurements, what we have there is essentially measurement at a resolution of 8,636 dpi in our case, so much higher resolution. And so here are some example data of the sort of direct comparisons of scanner-based and sort of microscope-based high-resolution sort of surface intensity data. So here's just a series of six series chronology, or chronology composed of 6 series, showing the maximum blue intensity or the Lakewood blue intensity values. Here's the delta blue intensity. I should say this is Norway spruce, so we don't really have any clear heartwood sapwood color change issues in this case. But then when we look at the surface intensity data, we see something like this with sort of mean values that are more or less approaching maximum blue intensity. But one key observation here or thing to note is that the variance of the surface intensity data is much greater than both the maximum blue and the delta blue. Looking at the signal, sort of signal strength or common the inter-series correlation, R-bar, or expressed population signal, or EPS. Here's what we have with the maximum blue data, where we have values around 0.2 to 0.3-ish, and EPS around 0.6, 0.7, 0.75. Similar for delta blue, correction actually weakens the signal a little bit in this case. It's not really surprising also because it is Norway spruce. But when we look at the surface intensity data, the R-bars really noticeably higher on the order of 0.6 in general, and the EPS also basically around 0.85, 0.9 in most cases, with a weaker period here in the 1950s, early 1960s in this. But again, I should highlight and sort of stress that this is working with the replication of 6 series. Of course, it will be necessary to explore this further when replication size increases. And then we have a sort of like for like comparison of the chronologies, both looking at the scanner-based blue intensity value and the surface intensity values. Just looking at the comparison of the maximum blue intensity and the surface intensity data against summer temperatures, or the optimal season for these 2 parameters. It's quite interesting. In general, it's again just based on 6 series, so there might be some criticism that really to have a adequate signal in the maximum blue data, of course the replication would need to be higher. I think probably also the signal would improve in the surface intensity data with higher replication as well, so that will be something to look at. But in general, there are periods of the 2 parameters perform similarly on the whole. Some periods where surface intensity overperforms a little bit. Then we see this period of weaker common signal that we saw before in the surface intensity data, where it actually does not perform quite as well as the maximum blue. Then sort of switching a little bit to a different species, Pinus sembra, so pine species. We can sort of look at a similar comparison with, in this case, 5 series chronologies. However, in this case, they are aligned according to the heartwood-sapwood transition. So again, where we have this very clear break in the reflectance properties and the color properties in the blue intensity data. And what we see here is actually this very pronounced drop in the blue BI Lakewood blue data measurements just after the heartwood-sapwood transition. Looking at the delta blue intensity, we see that actually this corrects for the Hartwood-Sapwood transition and the color differences between those two sections. So that looks very, very nice, and that's really where a lot of the strength of the Delta Blue sort of approach can be seen. Very interestingly now, when we look at the surface intensity data, this is the series, or the chronology rather, and what we see is actually that we do not see the same dip that we do in the Lakewood Blue data, and in general the measurements or the values there, so the index values there are higher. However, at the same time, they are not as high as the Delta Blue values. So that's quite an interesting, I think, observation. And really the question there is which of these two is more correct? And I think that definitely needs to be explored in more detail. Okay, just to finish off. So in general, if we talk about chemical treatment options, I would say looking ahead and into the future, I wonder, can this really actually offer real solutions to, the color-related biases and other issues that we have? It really would be interesting to have a discussion about what else could be done to help with these sort of issues. Another different type of approach might be maybe in the domain of data and signal processing and other statistical correction approaches to, color discoloration and Hartwood-Sapwood step issues. So of course we have the Delta Blue method that we talked about. So of course this is an incredibly very useful technique. The question is, could this also be, is there something else to develop in this area? Can it be pushed even further or not? Has that reached its limit in terms of what it can do and how it can be used? Another different approach might then be based on Daniel Druckenbrod's work using the curve intervention detection method in relation to blue intensity data to identify and correct for sort of these step changes that we have when we look at the transition from the Hartwood to Sapwood on an individual series level. And this is something that's, Rob and Dan and others are exploring right now. I also wonder, is there maybe some place for machine learning in all of this? I recently started thinking about this when trying to measure these blue intensity, these surface intensity data, just using QRecorder, where really it's at the moment really not very well suited to do this in an optimal way. And either with these kind of approaches maybe might make it possible to automatically or semi-automatically identify ring boundaries and adequately, especially if they're not straight or there's some curving of these boundaries. I mean, of course, this could be done in a more simple way, just with certain programs or adjusting programs in a way to do this kind of measurement. But there's quite a lot of effort, or several people or a lot of people that are exploring these sort of approaches to automated measuring of these kinds of, whether it's ring width or other types of tree ring data or tree ring samples. So then with the high resolution microscopy approaches, I talked about the surface intensity parameter and developing a binary representation of the anatomical structure, which has the potential to really develop these colorless blue intensity-like, parameter from these high resolution images without the drawbacks that we currently have with traditional blue intensity data. Most of all, color biases, which really show up in most studies which use blue intensity data at the moment, then this technique might also be able to sort of resolve, or should be able to resolve, a lot of these resolution-related issues as well, potentially. And in the future, I guess there might also be some potential to extract both, intra-annual information as well, and then also in time the development of quantitative wood anatomy-like data just from the surface of the samples. But of course, I should say that as the technique as it is right now, it's not quite as cheap as regular blue intensity, and also the data generation also takes some time. I think some of that can be, we can speed up the process, and there are systems out there, microscope systems with cameras and these automated stages, which are not super expensive, but of course it's still more expensive than generating regular blue. Another thing, of course, this is very highly experimental approach, and a lot of additional testing and research is still needed to explore everything properly. And then it might also be interesting to look at other intermediate, solutions, or in terms of resolution, somewhere in the middle. For example, like the Atrix system, which might offer sort of a nice compromise between things like resolution, as long as we can figure out these, color-related issues, or then that might actually be a suitable compromise, which is also not too expensive. Okay, that's everything. I think that was a little bit longer than I planned, but
yes, Melos, you didn't get the 10-minute remit.
Sorry.
But that's fine, no worries. Can I, before we just open up to questions, because I have some questions, I got my email wrong, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen again. I apologize. So you should be able to see my email. So I apologize. I've been reading the info. I can't get the chat function working while everyone is outside the team, essentially. So if anyone emails me, and then I will then add you all to the team, which will make things a lot easier for the next meeting, whenever that is. Hopefully that's given everyone, instead of co.uk, it's ac.uk for academic. So then I will unshare that now. Before we open that to the floor, I have one observation. I think Milos asked about my experience when Delta Blue did not work. Okay, so for sure, many of the Australian species we've been working with, clearly we struggled. And the Fitzroy in South America, and we've got a lot of well-replicated data sets there. This goes from an incredibly dark, rusty red heartwood to a light sapwood, and there's absolutely no way that the Delta Blue, as we currently calculate it, can correct for that. So we've gone the signal strength, signal processing approach with Dan Druckenwood and Ed Cook to overcome this. However, my observation for all of this is that the variance of the earlywood blue raw data and the variance of the latewood blue data is crucial in this correction adjustment, should I say, and that's the issue. And the variance changes from species to species. And I guess Jesper and me, to a certain degree, with Hemlock, we were just really lucky for the first species that it worked, right? If you had started on Fitzroy, you would have given up, right? Nice idea. Or you might have then just put a smoothing function through the trend and then done it that way and then work with the high frequency. So I'm not saying that. So the current methodology, as Milos said, does not work all the time, but it's very unappetizing to have a method that sometimes seems to work and sometimes doesn't work, because you actually want to understand, okay, from the properties of the data that we understand, it should work with these data, but there's no hope for here. We have to do something else. But at the moment, I guess, the more species we play with, the more we can experiment. But the variance of the parameters is crucial. That's all I can say, but I don't have a simple answer there. Maybe I'm going to say Christina, but it's not Christina, it's Jesper. I was just looking at it. Yeah. Jesper might have an answer.
I could say that it's not only the variance, but it's also about the signal. If the signal, the variation is the same, then we will dilute the delta parameter from signal. So that's also crucial.
Yeah.
But the reason why it was so successful for Scots pine in northern Sweden was that the variance was higher in the late wood, which is often is, and it sort of also enhanced the summer temperature signal, which was really a fluke. I mean, that was just just nice surprise. But the big win was that it corrected for the hardwood sapwood problem. But as Milos said, it overcompensates. So you have to do some additional adjustments, and that's not very straightforward. So, yeah.
So any other comments on the 3 short talks in inverted commas that we just had?
I would just want to say also that when Milos showed that the black and white images, they work really nicely, right? And the resolution is tremendously high, which is also good. But if we use old algorithms for our image analysis, that's going to reduce the measurement resolution back to what we have with a low resolution image. And if we use sort of a line that we move through the sample, and that line is not exactly matched by the ring boundary, then we will borrow information from the early wood from the following year and borrow information from the early wood of the current year. And that will also dilute the signal. So if we can sort of convince the community of the image analysis developers to sort of adapt to the current sort of new standard that Milos and others are developing, then I think we can make another jump and maybe improve the R-bar and maybe the temperature signal even more. So, yeah, that's also a comment.
I mean, certainly the signal we seem to be able to attain now with these data is transformative. I mean, I'm thinking as a climatologist now, if we can create these millennial long chronologies and your local calibration is well above 60%, you know, that's amazing. You know, that's, you know, of course we need to make, anyway, that's something we need to strive for. And, you know, the quicker we can do it, the better, right?
Yes. Oh, sorry, Georg. I'll just very briefly on relation to what Jesper was just saying. Yeah, I totally agree. I think right now we sort of need to maybe develop more of the tools that we have to make most use of, you know, these sort of data, because right now I don't have an optimal way of measuring this parameter, and it's really exactly the sort of things that you said. You know, there's early wood coming in from the next ring. And you know, if you have a sort of curved ring boundary, it's a bit of a nightmare to measure that at the moment, unless you focus on a very narrow area, and then of course you have a potential some noise coming in. So this I think needs to be developed. Yeah, we need to look at this. Sorry, Georg. Yes, go.
Yeah. Okay, super. So very nice work, Milos. It's really great. Now you were saying towards the end. That it's not cheap, it's expensive, not everyone is able to afford, but probably everyone is able to basically reproduce your blackening and you know, chalk procedure, and that alone would already improve a lot from my understanding. I mean, that's something I wanted to say or comment. Then I have a question to the blue intensity experts. When it's about the delta blue, was there ever a study seeing or checking how this is influenced by ring width? Also considering that some of the methods are resolution biased, right? And I could imagine that actually, well, if you move towards narrower rings also, now considering you have this hardwood, sapwood transition, which causes problems. At the same time, as we move from the core to the bark, we also experience narrower rings. And to me, that seems like a very challenging mix of confounding factors that is really hard to disentangle. And this maybe speaks another strong word for what Milos is exploring here.
I don't know. Well, I mean, not with the Delta blue, but with the Lakewood blue in our Yukon material, where they're extremely slow growing white spruce trees, we actually get a strengthening in the signal through the 20th century rather than a weakening, so you would expect the weakening if you've got this resolution issue. And that's basically related to the instrumental data, right? There's a change around 1944 between Dawson and whatever comes in. We did note, though, that it took us quite a lot of sites before we got that improved signal. So when we started with initially 5 sites in the Yukon, it was a little noisy, and clearly we struggled with the tight rings. But as we went up to 70 or more than 15 sites, then everything started behaving. So we are experimenting with one of these Kayence high resolution digital microscope systems to try to measure these outer ring sequences to see if we can address this issue. Whether it is an issue or not, I don't know. I mean, how low is good enough? Is that the right way around? That hasn't been quantified as well. And, that's why I kind of highlighted when I did that simple comparison of the Delta blue from the Pyrenees, Scotland and Scandinavia with the density. When you look at 1816, which is a thin ring, right? It's a cold summer. Then the blue somehow seems to be more sensitive than the density. Now, that might be just a fluke of the 3 data sets and the 3 sites, but, I think in time, that is just one area. Since Jesper's 2019 paper, we need to be aware that this could be an issue, right?
So, yeah, the comparison that you just mentioned, Rob, with the MXD and the Delta blue for the Western Europe, if you were to do the delta density and compare that to the Delta blue, then you would probably end up with pretty much the same result. So it's you do affect the signal of the Lakewood when you take away information with the early wood. So
I have a question to you, because are you frustrated that no one actually is using delta density in the density community?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't work. Or actually, Christina tested if the delta density would be sort of a next generation density parameter on the entire ITRDB Schweingruber network, and the improvement was, I mean, very, very small. So we just abandoned that idea pretty quickly. So, I mean, it works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, the trees are responding in different ways in different places, as we all know, and in the Southern Hemisphere more so. So, I mean, it's just, you have to test every time. It's
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Maybe related to this, just wondering, I mean, Jesper, you said the Earlywood blue intensity is basically just a constant, right? So obviously then under normal circumstances, you cannot expect a boost from the Delta blue. However, when you move to, let's say, confounding color differences there, I would say it should matter, right? However, if the wood is kind of constant and regular, it doesn't matter. It should not matter. From my understanding.
For spruce, it's you're probably better off not using it, because if you think of it, the signal strength or the R bar of the Lakewood parameter is always higher than in the Earlywood, and if you take away a noisy parameter from a high signal parameter, you introduce noise in the high signal parameter, so it's not going to be optimal. It's just that the alternative not using it is worse. So yeah, and also the variance is very low, so it doesn't matter that much for the signal.
And actually that's where this kind of group is, because I have reviewed papers where they've done Delta blue on spruce, and there's no theoretical reason why you should do that, right? And as you say, the signal is almost, in fact, if you actually try to calculate on the spruce networks that we've got from British Columbia up to the Yukon, for those sites we just did it for fun, then the Delta blue behaves very like the trends we see in the ring width data, which is, I don't know what that means, but that's, and I'm talking trends in the data. So the ring width data is very odd in these areas and really you know, anyway, it doesn't matter the details, but delta blue is definitely not the better summer temperature signal as we get in the Lakewood, that's for sure. But you still get people trying to submit papers looking at delta blue in spruce species or species without a heartwood sapwood color change.
I mean, it could be a valid approach if you have another source of color bias in your spruce series, which can happen. So then it's a matter of, okay, do we need to do it or not? And then, you know, is there a reason for implementing that or not? So I think it's maybe, but in general, yeah, you're right. Like you should be able to just get away with Lakewood, you know, maximum blue, and in most cases that's probably okay. But I guess with, you know, if you have enough high enough replication, then it shouldn't matter too much, because then you can probably overcome the noise issue with the delta correction that you otherwise would have, I guess.
But then it becomes a problem of having very low replication when we move back in time. So
yeah, true.
Sometimes, I mean, every chronology starts with one tree and then it increases. So
yeah, you'd have to be careful with that, I think.
and unless it's a plantation and all the trees started growing on the same day, but you know,
that's a special case, but it's not very useful for clamping.
It sounds like a Scottish case to me. Alma.
I removed the mask because maybe it's better. Do you find any correlation between Lakewood blue intensity and Lakewood width? Do you know?
Yeah, for sure. Jesper would know better.
I could give a very interesting example of the latest development in the CellClean project that Georg is running. We're doing actually quantitative wood anatomy, but it applies to blue intensity as well. And we have developed a 1200-year-long chronology from Tornaträsk, which is sort of the iconic backbone of all temperature reconstructions done in the past 20 years. So the MXD parameter there. And what we found is that the Lakewood width measured at anatomical precision has almost the identical signal to the MXD parameter. And then it's really, I think this is maybe unique in the world, but then if you think of it, the resolution issue is not an issue anymore, because if we have measure it MXD at a low resolution, it will be artificially more and more similar to the Lakewood width, and the Lakewood width has the same signal as the MXD, so it doesn't matter. It's really a special case.
Even ring width and density is quite strongly positively correlated in Scandinavia for pine as well. I mean, so I would suggest that you got the Icefields samples, do the same there, and you won't get the same result.
No. I mean, not even the NSCAN has that strong signal in the Lakewood width, right, and that's I mean, just a stone throw away if you consider the Northern Hemisphere as your playing field. So it's very weird. But the Lakewood BI, short answer, could be very well correlated with the Lakewood width, but not always.
Okay, because I was thinking about, so you talk about the different colors between hardwood and sapwood, and I understand this is a critical issue for blue intensity, but do you think we can somehow standardize using the Lakewood width when we are dealing in the sapwood?
I don't know. There is no real transition from heartwood to sapwood in terms of the width, not even the Lakewood width. So I don't know how that's gonna. I don't think so, but I haven't tested.
Okay, thanks.
I want to quickly say something. I got to leave in a minute, but maybe one comment also to what you said, Rob. When is enough, right? Also, you, Richard, made a comment about the Tesla and Skoda, I guess it was. I just think in any field, including the blue intensity, you have to really try to go top notch, and then you can start to see, okay, if we reduce the effort, how much does the signal downgrade as well? But there is no shortcut here. You have to do the maximum effort and then you reduce. So there is no other way. Now, Jesper made this example about the Tornit Trask. So without high precision measurements, we would not be there. And probably we still need to discuss, Jesper and me, what it means. Or what we do with this. Also, Milos, with his results, was kind of making a clear point in this direction, I would say. So looking forward to follow-ups. See you around.
Yeah. Thanks, Longo. Marcin.
I'll say real quickly that I think what we're doing right now in terms of the resolution, at least, is probably overkill for blue intensity or blue intensity-like parameter, because we probably don't need the resolution to be as high as it is. But then when we want to maybe start to look at things like wood anatomy, then it's still relevant. But yeah, for sure, I think then you could probably, as Georg was saying, just kind of start big and then see where you can sort of trim a little bit and slim things down a little bit, make it a bit easier, faster, and then you can really see, you can have that comparison and see what works and what doesn't, depending on what you want to do with it.
And I was going to say it really depends, because I know we've got some members from the archaeological community here, and they are not going to want to spend even £5,000 on a system when maybe £1,000 scanner plus Lakewood blue plus normal ring width would be enough for their purposes, right? Their goal is then to build reference chronologies. So we've got to keep this in mind, and the data they produce, right, from those systems are still usable as long as we know how they were produced and on what systems, because we can then understand maybe what the potential biases would be with either low resolution or a lack of resin extraction or whatever. And it's trying to understand that full spectrum of potential data that comes out of this. Yeah, it's all very well going for the very, very, very best, but then you're not going to have a lot of, it's going to take you a lot of time to cover a lot of species. And it's clear that every species has a slightly different nuance. Even the same species in the same region seems to be doing slightly different things, so I think
depends if you want to go for quantity or quality.
Well, there's precision and accuracy. You can have a precise system, but both systems can be accurate. But the other system, you might need a lot of data to get to the same accuracy. But it's understanding the potential limitations that impact the accuracy.
I would say there are limits to that. Even with unlimited data, you will, like with the resolution issues, it doesn't matter how many, if you have a site with species and you just have those narrow rings, you will probably get resolution related bias with that if you don't have a high enough resolution system to to sort of take that into account. But of course, I mean that might be a specific if you have a long climate reconstruction that you're trying to develop and you have these sort of issues, then that's probably something you want to explore. If it's a different context, different setting, depending on exactly what you want to do, that might not be necessary. So I mean I agree with you on that, but I think there is a limit to what the standard systems can do, and so let's see what we can do sort of beyond that.
Yeah, so clearly we have two different opinions.
Marcin has
but yeah, we need to continue with our meeting, and Marcin is waiting for quite a long time. So short question, please.
Well, in fact, I have two questions, but they are both short. So first of all, I have no experience with blue intensity, but let's imagine that I'm going to compare two species, one with the very distinct hardwood and softwood part, and the other like Norway spruce. So which proxy should I use then? And in fact, the second question is somehow related with, let's imagine that I intend to compare two Scots pine stands, but one is, let's say, like from the typical condition and the other from more swamp condition when I have lots of resins in it. And in this case, should I apply exactly the same resin extraction approach with Soxhlet, or try to adjust it according to the resin content?
So for the second question, the answer is easy because we know how to deal with resin. This is easy to extract. You use acetone or alcohol and you extract almost all resin. depends how long you run the extraction. So in the worst case, you keep your samples for 72 hours in Socled and Zoclay. So the problem, it's not the resin, it's the other chemicals which color the hardwood. So this is something that we don't really know how to tackle. And delta blue intensity, it's one of the ways to deal with this color change, color difference.
So your suggestion is to use delta blue in such case?
It also depends if you want to compare high resolution, not resolution, for how frequency signal and low frequency signal. So for high frequency, you don't really need to care so much about this difference of color between hardwood and softwood.
Yeah, I mean, I would also suggest that, you know, with your in your spruce example, that's the one you have to do least processing with regards to resin extraction and everything. So you could hypothesize that that's your cleanest signal, as long as it's from a sort of, the expectation is temperature limitation. I mean, climate, your expected climate signal is important here. So then when you then look at the pine chronology, after you've done whatever correction, whether that's resin extraction plus then delta blue, one would hypothesize that then the resulting chronologies should be the same, or at least very similar, with a similar response to summer temperature. Now, Jesper may know this, but I think when I was up in Stockholm many years ago, Bjorn Gunnarsson was comparing density from spruce with pine, and the climate signal was always stronger in the pine than the spruce, if I remember. And so that was kind of why they worked more with pine. But, you know, the spruce was very similar. It was just slightly stronger in the pine. So, and then in your boggy environment, well, I would expect the response to be different. So then if that chronology is different, then, you know, bog pine is a different creature, right? The bog
Again,
pine
depends what you want to study, because we automatically switch to dendroclimatology. And I don't know if this is your aim at all.
Okay, now it's clear. I just wonder, there should be applied a different resin extraction approach in terms of the resin content, but now it's clear for me that I have to adjust it to the samples that contains the highest amount of resins, right?
Yeah, this is a good solution.
I think also that at VSL, Fritz and his colleagues, they developed protocols for how to treat different conifers. I mean, like larch and pine, they have different protocols. And I think they use water extraction for the larch, for instance, because they have a lot of water-soluble contents that they want to get rid of. So I think, I mean, just experiment and also, yeah, I mean, pine and spruce, they are very different, and but I think that spruce also has some contents that you would want to get rid of, but the effect will not be very, very large. So yeah, I think you should experiment.
Yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, we have protocol only for actually one species and very particular environment. For the rest, we need to be careful, and the experiments are the best way to tackle this. But if for larch, if I'm not mistaken, they use both alcohol and water.
Yeah.
So maybe don't use pure alcohol.
I have some experience with larch, and it was mostly for the densitometry, but I tried to compare pure water and acetone with water, and finally I came to the conclusion that the pure water is better, as Jesper said.
Yeah.
Any other questions then before we slowly wrap up and just briefly talk about the future of the initiative, which I guess was the main aim of all of this? It was I mean, oh, Mauricio, go for it. Mr. Fuentes, are you there?
What about now? Now do you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Yes. Okay. So I had double stop for the microphone because I screwed up yesterday. I was talking in the car. Yeah, a short question. What about this initiative on trying to find funding? What do you think, guys?
Okay, so yeah, I can't remember if it was you.
Straight to the point.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is in a way one of the primary aims of getting collaborative groups together, right? Is so my example is only after 2 years of trying, me with Columbia University through NSF and NERC, we've managed to get funding for the Australasian work. It's taken a while and a lot of proposal writings and, you know, the way it is, right? So most of us are European here, not all of us. So the EU funding schemes may be possible, you know, and I think we've got to be creative, and it depends on, again, the project, right? So I would actually argue that the historians, the archaeologists, the historical dating people may be in a better position than the climatologists, because through the AHRC in the UK and through the EU, there may be all sorts of more socially relevant types of projects for collaborative things, for creating networks of data sets, for provenancing and timber exchange and all of that kind of stuff. I think the climatological community might have a harder sell, to be honest, because we're very data rich in Europe for many areas. So, you know, yeah, I mean, that's always going to be an issue. So, you know, yeah, I don't have the answer there. The Swiss have all the money. Any answers? Patrick? Yes. You're muted.
No,
we can't hear you.
Yeah, the microphone's not.
Shall I say something or?
Yeah.
If you can lip read, Patrick, then just just say what he's saying.
No.
No, we cannot hear you.
And there's no chat either. I really apologize for the chat. There's nothing in the help files that can add it on.
And do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, that's...
loud and clear.
No, I don't know. I mean, for me, the question about the funding, well, it would be nice to have a big funding where many people can be involved. But usually my experience is also at the country level, you can find some foundation or something to finance some small project. But if we coordinate that in a nice way, then maybe you facilitate the country funding and you can do also something big. So we don't need always to think something that cover everything, but just try to help ourselves to have several proposal going in different country and try to raise some money synergetically somehow. Since I have the word, I just wanted to comment one thing about the quantity versus quality. I don't think that the two things are in contrast, actually. I strongly believe that, well, when we want to do big study, probably quantity is important, but the quality is try to understand better what is behind and maybe to know the limitation of the quantity. So I think we need to move on the two level, but it doesn't mean that when we do big, we have always high quality. It can be also low. So that was just a comment I wanted to add.
I should just add to with regards to, you know, say small funding pots at country levels. I mean, the NTrend initiative that we, you know, published 5 years ago, there was no collective big funding approach to that, right? We tried that through Pages, and then Pages did their own thing. So in the end, it was just different groups working together, and, you know, it's not as strategic as I would have liked, but that ultimately was all of us having a common vision, and then independently the individuals then trying to get the funding within that. I think it's very difficult to get international level type funding. You know, we're not doing Antarctic research or space research. Maybe we should, but you know, it's a different ball game now, right? And you know, and climate research has changed now than it was 20 years ago. It's more going to, I don't know, adaptation and mitigation rather than understanding the fundamentals of climate change now. So I don't think we can play those same cards as it was possible 20 years ago. But that's just my sort of opinion, my opinion, I think. Mauricio, I think you've got an old hand up. Aoife, pronouncing the right.
Finally.
Taken me a whole week to learn their name.
Yeah. Is it my turn now?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm just put my camera on, but I'm out in the garden, so I don't know if my Wi-Fi will reach, but we'll give it a go. It's boiling here in Denmark, so I'm thinking for us in the historical dendrochronology, we're way behind you guys in the climate, and I think maybe the thing that I feel is to be able to sort of take some kind of study visit with one of your labs for a week. And I don't know, I don't speak for everybody else because we haven't coordinated this beforehand, but that might start us off. So if we can apply for funding for some kind of network where we can visit one or other of you guys who are already doing blue intensity so that we can get a sort of kickstart, that lovely diagram that you showed earlier of somebody giving us a hand up. So that's a sort of yes, please from my garden.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think, I mean, you know, maybe, you know, as we slowly wrap up about, you know, how we move forward, it might be good to have sort of the old thematic meetings where we might have a separate meeting of maybe climatey people and another meeting of historical people, and then arrange either separate workshops as a possibility, or visits, right? Depending on who's who, and we can create a network of training people rather than everyone coming to one lab. Is you can start networking and moving it outwards. I mean, to be honest, I don't think it was, I know that last Friday, people learning to use Q-Recorder and C-Dendro in about 2 hours in a virtual environment wasn't the easiest thing. But at the same time, some of the participants did manage to date the building, you know, with minimal effort.
I think the whole sample preparation thing is a big gap in that, and we need to be physically together for that, because I kind of almost need a shopping list. What kind of sander do I use? How will I actually take sub-samples of my archaeological samples, and how will I play with stuff like the color? I almost need like a shopping list. And then I guess I need to be able to come to one of you and look over your shoulder and try it myself, and then sort of get started properly rather than experimenting on my own. And I think in terms of that, we need to raise some money. So there's loads of sort of relatively accessible sort of network type funding that you can apply for across Europe or across the world even, you know. So, and I don't know if we should maybe appoint some kind of subcommittee that's going to work on identifying funding and making some applications there, sort of big or small.
I mean, I know that most universities, for example, will have sort of fellowship schemes for sabbatical visits and such things. I know in the UK, the Royal Society has funding for visiting researchers. I mean, these are individual things, but yeah, you know, there's different levels. Are we looking at funding for the individual or for groups? I would also quickly state, though, we did a lot of experiments about the historical dating. You don't need to do any resin extraction. You just need to sand your samples flat with a belt sander and go up to 600 or 1200, and you'll be fine. The dating will be fine. And even if you have a Hartwood-Sapwood change, doesn't make any difference to the dating. So, you know, from a dating point of view, you can keep it as simple as possible. You know, so it doesn't need to be, in a way, for the climatologists, the biases we've talked about are fundamentally more important. Anyone else, anything to add? But you're right, the funding is.
I felt a little bit that even though our needs for the archaeological material aren't nearly as kind of particular as the climatologists, it would be kind of a nice thing that we could deliver our data to the climatologists so you could use it. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from, that we get it right from the beginning.
Yeah.
But maybe us, the historical dendrochronologists, should actually make a sort of subgroup and try and brainstorm our way to how we start. That would be great for me, I think. So all of the rest of you who are listening, dendroarchaeologists.
Yeah, can I jump in there? I'd agree with that. The trouble is that we're looking at the e-scooter rather than the Tesla, I think.
The e-scooter. Is that the Sinclair version from the 1980s, or a little bit more modern?
Nothing as modern as Sinclair, no.
But anyway, I would keep in mind what Patrick said. So maybe it's better to set up, and also Georg, your goals a bit higher and establish the protocol to prepare your wood that will be also at least partially used for climatology later on. So yeah, not to lose this opportunity from the beginning. But I think that this, I mean, discussions like that, it's something that we really want to have in our I-band group. But yeah, I think that we need to establish this first. And I don't know for how long you can stay with us, because it's already much longer than we proposed. So maybe we can slowly go to the other points.
Well, actually, some of the other points are basically related about how do we move forward. I mean, you know, if we then have organize a set of meetings in the coming months, I guess, where there could be meetings that could be focused purely on the archaeological aspects with regards to, well, what would be a minimum protocol set, you know, not only with the actual lab-based methods and what would be needed that theoretically could make the data relevant for other groups like climatologists. Then there is the issue of networks and how you create networks and how you would even start that, especially when we're talking about new areas. Then there's the climatological aspect, and then that's really the detailed methodology. So we might want to have a sort of a schedule of different meetings where a smaller subsets, you know, I'm not sure we need a subcommittee, but the committee of I-band, because that was what that first thing is, sort of a coordination team, should have.
Yeah, so before we create subcommittee, we need community.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So I guess if anyone wants to be on the coordination team, you know, and it doesn't need to be, but people who are either very experienced with blue already or generally feel that they want to embrace blue and be part of this discussion as we move on over the months and years, then I guess email me and Richard, and then we can start that aspect of getting the formal. I kind of hate formal hierarchies, but we do need some sort of coordination team. But I actually also want to have the discussion open for all the users to a certain degree. I mean, we must remember that this is, you know, what is, you know, the climatologists are clearly developing data that's useful for the archaeologists, but the archaeologists can also create data that can be used for the other way around. And as long as both groups are talking, then we can ensure that there is some sort of common goal and protocols, you know, and so forth, right? So that's the thematic meeting. So we can have very focused meetings going forward. We don't need to necessarily have workshops essentially, but discussions for even an hour. Okay, we want to do this. We want to create a network in North America or a network in Europe for whatever. How do we go about it? Related to that, I would be quite keen to have, at least while we're in the online world, it'd be the best. We're all used to this now. A online series of seminars where people either present preliminary data or they're struggling with some aspect, they want to present something, or even more formal presentations of, we've spent the last 3 years doing this, this is our final product, we've got a paper in submission. I think a whole range of talks could easily be done. It doesn't have to be weekly, it could be just one a month. Finding a time that works for everyone with teaching and other responsibilities might be difficult, but sometime in the afternoon of the UK would work with Asia and would also work with North America, right? The poor North Americans have to get up early for the Europeans, but we also want to do it early enough so that the Asians, it's not midnight when they're doing this. So, you know, 3 or 4 in the afternoon in the UK or Europe probably works for most people, right? And I think a set of, you know, this is expanding, especially on the historical dating side. You know, how do we bring these different parameters together, right? We're measuring in ring width, we can add blue, latewood blue, but maybe we can then add earlywood blue, and then suddenly then you're getting into complex methodologies that can really, it'd be good to get some statisticians in there. How can we bring all this data together to move things really forward? So there's all sorts of stuff we could do here. I see nods but silence. Now the question is, I'm on holiday the next 3 weeks, so nothing's gonna happen for 3 weeks. I will create the MS Teams group. Now, for those who have used MS Teams, then there is a chat function that theoretically, if you've got the software running, you can then just ping questions at any time. I will freely admit, though, that I never have Teams running because I'm in so many team groups because of work that my phone would be pinging all the time. So that doesn't always work but the nice thing about Teams is that we can archive files. We can use the platform for seminars and meetings like this, and everything is all inclusive. So I think this would work. Richard and I have done a lot of workshops over the last few years with whether it's Wildendro or Trace. And I would be very keen if other people are keen to be part of these workshops, because the danger is we kind of get very insular with our approach, right? One group's methodology might not represent other groups' experiences. And the more we get into that, helps to spread the methodology and probably will help to get to some sort of, hopefully, a consistent protocol of usage. I mean, you know, at the moment there is clearly differences, right? We need discussions. So, you know, when there are calls out, so Emeridendro has a call out for workshops. Trevor Porter and Ignacio Mundo have asked me whether we do a blue workshop. I would suggest, and I'm looking at April here, that at least some of the North Americans should be involved. That would be Karen and, you know, Grant. You know, so, you know, we want to spread this as a global initiative as well, that it's not just a few people. The more we can spread this and we move it, then the methodology would improve. I don't know if I noticed that, Richard, you're teaching on the Dendro Field Week and WSL. Do you do blue for that, or you do something else?
I think that this year it will be blue, but it's not every year like that. So but also it's also this Field Week.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's another venue where you actually, with the expertise that WSL has, where you could actually get groups working with both QWA data. Can we call it QAR? Something easier, the QAR data as a QAR and blue or something like that, you know, because then you can get people thinking about these different there are different methods measuring similar wood properties, and some are less precise but are easier, and some are more precise and time consuming. But when you compare them, what can we learn from that comparison? And that would be something to wrap into workshops, and that might be a way of fusing iBind and QNet together a little bit, maybe through these workshops. So that's just an idea as well. But I'm looking at Jesper in that regard, because I guess WSL is the focal point. Georg's left now, so it's can't point to him. Does anyone else have any other issues to raise? Because I think for me, the first thing is I'm going to try and set up the MS Teams, and then I'll have everyone's emails so I can communicate. I would suggest that at the very least, we can, if anyone wants to give talks on any aspect of their work, whether a student with some preliminary results and they're a bit confused, up to a more senior scientist who's got something very refined and sexy, you know, new methods. You know, Milos has finally measured 8 samples and he wants to present the results from the new 2 samples he's added to the mix. I'm sorry, I can make fun of you.
So you know, definitely we don't want to have 3 weeks break because only Rob is going on holidays. We are not.
That's true.
So yeah, so we can have first seminar in 1 month if you want.
I think, yeah, I'll be back in a month, but that's fine. That's yeah.
This should be doable, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, Monday's fine.
Yeah, so I think if anyone's interested in giving a talk, you know, keep it relatively, you know, it doesn't, you know, an hour for talk plus Q&A is enough and standard. Then email me and Richard and Milos, and then we can try and organize it. We might have to use doodle polls to optimize the time in the week. In the summer, it will be easier, I think. by the fact people might be on holidays. But in semester teaching time, it's probably going to get a bit harder. But we'll work that out as we go along. Okay. Have I missed anything else? I assume because most of us are European, there will probably be we'll try to tie in an annual physical meeting with Trace. I think seeing Trace is theoretically supporting this, although it's not clear to me how they're supporting us, but they are supporting us, if you know what I mean. So, but that might help with regards to funding of students getting to meetings and so forth, more in that line, I think. But
just to be fair, ITR supports workshops. So if we organize something outside of Trace, the regular Trace meeting, there is also a chance to get some financial support for students.
Yeah.
So not only making fun of them, but also making some facts straight. But there is also other possibilities to meet. There are other conferences, Ameridendro, Asian Dendro. So yeah, we need to be active and see what are the opportunities. But I think that what we really want to do for now is to stay online. So this would be the main means of communication for us. We learned this from the workshop that online brings much more people. Not necessarily that we can offer the same quality of the teaching, but for the exchanging the ideas, this is, I think, fine enough tool.
I mean, admittedly, we did double the length of the workshop. So in a way, I think probably in the end, most of them probably got a similar experience, but it was hard work online. We would rather but you know,
Alma is noggin, so probably
it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, do we want to do a 2-day workshop every year? You know, if ATR and Trace goes hybrid, then it becomes tricky.
We'll think about this later.
Yeah.
It's doable though. I mean, it's possible to have a hybrid sort of format.
So anyway, you are here to suggest us what you want, and this is something that it's important because we have our own ideas, but this is supposed to be community and this is supposed to be network. And probably Rob is kind of president now, but yeah, we are kind of equal here.
No, I'm not. No. We'll just do it. Let's just go for the coordination team.
Yeah.
Mainly because of the last 12 months I would have been a useless leader. Life is a little easier at the moment, but that's no. We need to spread the love in that regard, I think. But that's fine. I mean, these things can be. I think as long as we have a sort of community-based initiative, and I think through Teams we can do that. We can have a mailing list as well, just in case that through the Teams messaging thing doesn't quite work. And if people are happy that information of the mailing list is available to all, then there can be an email to everyone involved and say, well, we've got an idea for doing a meeting on I don't know, conifer dating in Estonia. Or whatever, and then those interested, we can then have the get together for those who are interested.
I really like the idea to have a regular meeting or seminars where someone presents something, because this is a very informal way to exchange experience and troubles and problem or success, depends, and also is a good way to keep us in track and in contact. So I really like it. Thanks.
I think for sure the one thing that we've all benefited in during COVID times is the access to online seminar series. So I now go to the WSL, I go to Columbia, I go to Tucson, and I don't have to move. I mean, the timing of Tucson's a pain. It's the evening, and I need to have wine to survive the talk. But it's
poor you.
But it's true. I mean, we never had that before. We never contemplated it, but this should continue. So this will help for keeping this kind of, because these things are hard initiatives, because there'll be periods when not much happens, but in reality everyone has some data, everyone has a little presentation, and everyone has a struggle. I think it's the question, I've hit this problem, what does this mean, right? And then you could just present it. I have no answers. Does anyone have any? opinion, and then that's how collaboration happens, you know. And then someone might say, well, actually, you should try this. That might do this or whatever. And I think that's why we want a mix of talks, you know. So something that is not really finalized is fine, you know, especially with students who are coming at this for the first time, you know, and we can politely say, I think you're looking at the green intensity. That might be the wrong color. Have you tried blue? Have you read the papers or whatever? You know, it's you see, I can't chair this stuff because I can't not make fun of people. I would just offend people after time. Anyway, so I will try to get the team set up with all the emails I have before I leave on Monday. So we at least have the beginnings. I will then send the Google Doc with everyone's contact details around so we can ensure that we can communicate. And also, if everyone who sees the list sees that there is a name not on there that should be, then just add them on or get them to email me as well, so we can slowly build up the community. I'm very happy that there was only about 50 odd people here, not 150. So thankfully at the moment it's a relatively small community, but you know, I'd like to think there is enough potential results there to show that this is worth the effort to continue. It's just trying to get that balance between, as Georg said, yes, start high, but ultimately the end game is somewhere lower. It's how low that we want, because you know, I really get frustrated when we have it in our geochemistry labs. Oh, we're the one of 3 labs in the world that can do this. But then who's validating their results when, you know, so few people are? So the more you can then validate and test and experiment, then the method can improve, right? So, and I think that's where we're at now, where everyone, it could be chaos if we didn't manage it. Everyone's measuring blue, everyone's submitting papers, and a lot of horrible stuff could be done if you're not careful. So we've spent 10 years. I remember the Melbourne conference. There was Jesper, me, and Milos, basically telling everyone that blue was the best thing since sliced bread. And
I was also there.
You were there, yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
And but you know, it was a very nice session. I remember this session. There was a buzz because you know we were showing something that was available to everyone. But now we're in the state where we can actually suggest, well, it's not quite as good. There are issues. Now we need to address those issues, right? And that's the important thing now. So before I call the end of this hour extra long meeting, but we can blame Milos entirely on the extra length. Does anyone want to raise any other issues or ideas that we want to consider? Christina, Jesper?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about high resolution, and I think that the next step that we need to take is to really lobby the image analysis community. And I could be sort of a starting point there, because I already drafted a letter to Lars-Åke explaining the problem that if we have high resolution images, we don't get high resolution data because the image analysis programs are not there yet. So I would just like to have sort of the I bind in my back when I write to him and say that we want this, and an entire community is actually behind this. So
yeah, definitely.
I could sort of take charge on that one immediately, and then I'm also interested to be in the committee and with other administrative tasks as well. So I will definitely sign up for the committee assignments.
Cool, thanks. It's yeah, I mean, Petra, so I think Lars is lurking online, so he's listening. So, you know, but yeah, you have my support for sure. And I know Holger's disappeared about half an hour ago or so, but I know he is creating, I've heard from Danny that he's creating an image analysis system, a bit like Tom Levanich's. I don't know how good or bad or where it is. But
it's true, but this is for the images.
I understand. I understand.
Programs that can handle these images, and that's the problem.
Yeah, but being purely selfish is I actually now have got quite a chunk of money to get a high resolution system. The question is what system should I get? Now, do I go for Tom Lavanich's? We have a KN system already in our school. The KN system does way more than I need to, but when I negotiate with them and say, well, I don't need to do a 3D image of a piece of wood, right? And I want just flat but high resolution, they won't reduce the prices, right? So it's trying to find a system that has the resolution that we want, maybe not too much. And I would, from this community, would very much welcome advice on potential systems. And I admit the software is, but that's another factor. But the system is still important, you know. And you know, you can spend a lot of money on a microscope and a camera capture system. And do we need, so, you know, can it be done for 5,000 instead of 50,000, right? And that's a big chunk of money.
But if you have a big chunk of money, I would talk to Dan Griffin, because he has a really nice system going. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's the sweet spot with the image production, so to speak? Yeah, it's an open question. I don't think anyone has the answer. But the system that Holger and Loike developed at VSL is, I mean, that's really a very nice product, but it's extremely custom made. So I guess if you could talk to them, I mean, personally, and ask them if they could replicate that, but it's not a off-the-shelf system.